Somewhere out in the wasteland, the wind moves through cracked concrete and overturned shopping carts in a way that sounds almost like music. The sky has that pale amber quality it gets in the late afternoon, not quite orange, not quite gray, and the silence between gusts is so complete you can hear the hiss of a distant radio signal hunting for a station. There is a skeleton propped against the wall of a collapsed diner. Its bony hand rests loosely around a bottle of Nuka-Cola, long since dried to a sticky residue inside the glass. The label is sun-faded, but you can still make out the cartoon mascot. He is smiling. He has always been smiling. He will always be smiling. Welcome to the wasteland. Settle in, get comfortable, and let the world dissolve around you. This is going to take a while, and that is entirely the point. Over the next several hours, we are going to walk very slowly through one of the most richly layered game universes ever constructed, pausing at every hidden corner, every in-joke, every buried reference, every moment where the developers stepped out from behind the curtain and left a little piece of themselves pressed into the dust. These are the Easter eggs of Fallout, and there are far more of them than you might expect. So pull the blanket a little closer. Breathe out. The bombs already fell. Nothing left to worry about now. Section 1. Origins. The seeds of the Easter egg tradition. Before we can understand why the Fallout series is so densely layered with secrets, references, and hidden jokes, it helps to understand where the whole thing began. Not just the franchise, but the specific culture that produced it. It was 1994 when a small California developer called Interplay began serious work on what would eventually become Fallout. The studio was run by a man named Brian Fargo, who had previously guided Wasteland, a 1988 post-apocalyptic RPG for Apple II and DOS computers that was, in its own strange way, one of the most ambitious games ever made for its era. Interplay had a culture, a very specific, irreverent, playful culture that treated game development less like the production of a commercial software product and more like the construction of a shared private joke that happened to be sold in stores. The programmers named files after themselves. They hid their faces in sprite sheets. They argued passionately about fictional politics and left those arguments embedded in dialogue trees that thousands of players would one day navigate without ever suspecting there was a real disagreement underneath. The man most responsible for the feel of Fallout was Tim Kaine, a programmer and designer who had originally been working on a different project entirely. He had been experimenting with a new character system, a set of attributes called Strength, Perception, Endurance, Charisma, Intelligence, Agility, and Luck, and realized, with some satisfaction, that these spelled out special. That small discovery delighted him. It was the kind of thing that felt like the universe winking at you. He took it as a sign that something worthwhile was being built. Kaine's vision for Fallout was shaped by a specific aesthetic, the retrofuturism of 1950s America. He was drawn to the idea of a world that had been frozen in the imagination of a particular historical moment, a post-war America full of optimism and gleaming chrome, of drive-in movies and atomic cocktails, and the earnest belief that technology would solve every problem. The bombs had not broken that world so much as preserved it in amber. The advertisements were still running. The mascots were still smiling. The corporate cheerfulness had calcified into something deeply strange. This tonal choice, cheerful on the surface, haunted underneath, became the defining characteristic of the franchise. It also became the ideal environment for Easter eggs, because Easter eggs are inherently about a gap between what appears on the surface and what is hidden beneath. The series was built from the beginning on the principle that there is always more than meets the eye. The special system itself was not just a design decision, it was a philosophical statement. Most role-playing games of the era used some version of Dungeons & Dragons' ability score framework, tracking attributes in small incremental numbers. Kaine and his team wanted something that felt more like a personality quiz than a stat sheet. The name Speckle was chosen, in part, because it communicated a certain warmth. You were not building a character, you were building a person. The fact that it also formed a slightly self-congratulatory acronym was absolutely intentional. The world that grew around Speckle was assembled by a team of writers and designers who read voraciously and referenced freely. The Vault-Tec Corporation, the company responsible for building the underground shelters that survivors of the nuclear war retreated into, was named in part as a nod to the real-world nuclear fallout shelter industry. that had briefly boomed in the early 1960s. But the name also carried a dark joke. Vaults, by design, were experiments. They were not built to save humanity. They were built to study it. The shelters had flaws engineered into them: population imbalances, resource deprivation, social stress tests, because Vault-Tec was not a humanitarian organization. It was a research firm. It was a company that had decided the apocalypse was a golden opportunity. This background detail, barely explained in the original game, hinted at rather than stated, became one of the most productive sources of hidden storytelling in the entire series. Every vault had a number, and every number concealed a story. We will explore those stories in detail later. For now, the important thing is to understand that from the very beginning, Fallout was a game designed to reward players who looked closely at things that appeared, on the surface, to be simple. The Pip-Boy, the wrist-mounted computer that serves as the player's primary interface, was designed by Leonard Boyarsky, one of Fallout's original art directors. Boyarsky's design drew on the visual language of 1950s industrial illustration, all smooth curves and cheerful dials. The kind of thing you might find in a Popular Mechanics advertisement from 1957. The character on the Pip-Boy's screen, the little Vault Boy, with his perpetual thumbs-up gesture, was also Boyarsky's creation, and he was based loosely on the mascot designs used by insurance companies and consumer brands of the post-war era. There is something deeply unsettling about the Vault Boy's smile when you consider the context he inhabits. That smile was designed to sell you a survival experience, while quietly confirming that survival was never guaranteed. The thumbs-up gesture, by the way, is not simply an expression of enthusiasm. It is a reference to a real-world method used to gauge the distance of a nuclear explosion. If you hold your thumb up at arm's length and the mushroom cloud is smaller than your thumb, you are probably safe to run. If the cloud is larger than your thumb, you should probably reconsider your plans. The Vault Boy is not congratulating you. He is performing a radiation assessment. This was confirmed by Fallout's creative team and has been a source of quiet delight for fans ever since. Even the name Fallout carries layers. The obvious meaning is nuclear fallout, the radioactive particles dispersed by an atomic explosion. But the word also implies a consequence, a falling out, a breakdown of a relationship or a system. The series is, at its core, about what happens after things fall apart. The title is doing double duty from the first syllable. The original game was released in 1997, and it arrived with a kind of specific literary confidence that suggested the developers had been thinking about this world for a long time. The opening cinematic used archival footage-style imagery and set it against a narration by Ron Perlman, an actor whose voice had a quality of measured gravity that made the end of the world sound almost peaceful. Perlman's line, "War never changes," became one of the most recognizable opening statements in video game history. It is also, quietly, a nod to a very old tradition of historical framing, the kind of solemn opening you might find in a documentary or a literary epic. The team's affection for literature was embedded throughout the original game. The character of the Master, the main antagonist, was a philosophical villain in the tradition of Victorian science fiction, a figure who had fused with a computer system and emerged with grand ambitions for the mutation of the human species. His arguments were coherent. His logic was internally consistent. The game was designed so that you could actually talk him out of his plan by pointing out its fundamental biological flaw. Super mutants were sterile. His army would eventually die out with no way to reproduce. The horror of the Master was not that he was evil in a simple sense, it was that he was almost right. This moral complexity was baked into the game from the start, and it created a tonal environment where Easter eggs and hidden references felt natural rather than incongruous. The game was already asking you to think carefully about everything you encountered. One of the earliest confirmed Easter eggs in Fallout 1 involves a simple map location that is easy to overlook. In the Boneyard, the ruins of Los Angeles, there is a small room containing a working television set and a skeleton sitting in a recliner in front of it. The television is playing static. There is a beer can on the side table next to the skeleton. This is a reference subtle and unannounced to the American cultural archetype of the couch potato. The person who died doing exactly what they always did, watching television on a weekend afternoon while the world outside changed irrevocably. It is funny and melancholy in equal measure, which is exactly the register Fallout operates in. There was also, in the first game, a brief and baffling encounter with a blue police box. If you happen to be in the right location at the right time, you might stumble across a small blue structure standing improbably in the desert. A strange whooshing sound played as you approached. This was, unmistakably, a TARDIS, the time machine from the British science fiction series Doctor Who. There was no explanation offered, no context given. The TARDIS was simply there, as if it had always been there, as if the developers were quietly communicating that the rules of this universe were not as fixed as they appeared. Doctor Who had been a formative cultural touchstone for several members of the original Fallout team, and this cameo was their private acknowledgement of a shared enthusiasm. It is worth pausing for a moment to consider what an Easter egg actually is, and why developers make them. The term comes from the 1979 Atari game Adventure, in which programmer Warren Robinett secretly embedded a hidden room containing his own name, a violation of Atari's policy of not crediting individual programmers. To find the room, you had to perform a very specific sequence of actions that the game never described or hinted at. Robinett was making a point. This world was made by a person, and that person wanted credit for it. The Easter egg tradition was born out of that specific desire to sign your work, to leave a mark, to say I was here. In Fallout's case, the Easter egg tradition became something richer than simple credit claiming. The games became dense with references, in-jokes, and hidden moments that communicated not just who made the game, but what the makers cared about, what books they loved, what films they watched, what arguments they had with each other in the interplay break room. Playing Fallout closely is, in a certain sense, like reading someone's diary. You learn more about the people who built it with every secret you find. The Mentats, the intelligence-boosting drug available throughout the series, are named after a fictional class of human computers from Frank Herbert's Dune. Mentats in the Dune universe were people trained to perform extraordinary feats of calculation and analysis in a civilization that had banned computers after a catastrophic AI war. The name was borrowed because it fit. In a world where traditional pharmaceutical infrastructure had collapsed, a drug that sharpened your thinking and enhanced recall would naturally have been named after the most iconic fictional human calculators in science fiction. It is a deep-cut reference, the kind that rewards players who have read widely. The Max's diary, found in the base of the Brotherhood of Steel, contains a passage about the Brotherhood's origin that includes a reference to Planet of the Apes. The soldier writing the diary describes marching through ruins and arriving at a place that seems familiar, then realizing with a sinking feeling that the ruins are American. The passage is written in a style that echoes the famous ending of the 1968 film, in which Charlton Heston's astronaut realizes he has landed on a post-nuclear Earth rather than an alien world. The Brotherhood soldier's horror is quieter, more personal, but the emotional structure of the moment is the same. The recognition that the world you thought you had escaped is the world you have always been standing in. From the very beginning, Fallout was a game that wore its influences openly, but carried them lightly. The references were not there to show off. They were there because the people building the game genuinely loved the things they were referencing, and that love made the world feel lived in rather than invented. A world built by people who have read things, watched things, and argued about things has a particular texture to it, a sense that every detail was chosen rather than generated. That texture is what made Fallout feel real in a way that a technically superior game might not. If you are listening to this right now, drop a comment with where you are in the world and what time it is. There is something genuinely lovely about knowing someone is hearing this from a completely different time zone, in a different kind of late-night quiet. If you have not hit subscribe yet, now is the time more of these are coming, and they take a long time to make. Back to the Wasteland. Section 2, Fallout 1 and 2. The Wild West of Developer Secrets. The original Fallout games, released in 1997 and 1998 respectively, were made during a specific era of game development that no longer quite exists. Studios were smaller, oversight was looser. The distance between a developer having an idea on Tuesday and that idea appearing in the shipped game on Friday was sometimes measured in hours. This meant that the early Fallout games were unusually personal documents full of jokes, references, and pieces of the developers' own lives that had been embedded in the code with a speed and casualness that felt closer to graffiti than to the carefully calibrated content of a modern production. The most famous example of this sensibility is the series of Monty Python references scattered throughout Fallout 2. The game takes place in Northern California and Nevada, following a tribal descendant of the original Vault Dweller, as they attempt to find a device called the Gek, a Garden of Eden creation kit to save their village. This is a serious premise. The game handles it, in large stretches, with genuine gravity, but it also contains a bridge guarded by a figure who will not let you cross until you answer 3 questions. The figure is called the Bridge Keeper, and if you give incorrect answers to his questions, he launches into a tirade that will be immediately recognizable to anyone who has seen Monty Python and the Holy Grail. The joke lands particularly well because it is delivered with total commitment. The Bridge Keeper treats his role with absolute seriousness, and that seriousness is exactly what makes the reference so funny. Not far from the Bridge Keeper, in a different random encounter on the world map, the player might stumble across a group of knights standing in a circle who demand a specific word before allowing passage. The word they require is "ni." The knights react with outrage if you refuse. They are the knights who say "ni," transplanted from 1975 Britain to the post-nuclear California wasteland, and they seem perfectly at home there. This is characteristic of Fallout 2's approach to its own absurdity. It does not break character for these references. It simply absorbs them into the world and allows the world to absorb them back. The random encounter system in Fallout 2 was particularly fertile ground for hidden content. As you traveled the world map, the game would occasionally pause and drop you into a small, scripted scenario, sometimes hostile, sometimes strange, sometimes both. One of the stranger encounters involved a robot standing in a clearing. The robot was, on close inspection, clearly a composite of several different fictional robots. It had the singular glowing eye of HAL 9000 from 2001, A Space Odyssey, the general body shape and excitable energy of Johnny Five from Short Circuit, and the slightly officious mannerisms of C-3PO from Star Wars. It would address you in a formal and slightly condescending tone, and then depending on your dialogue, choices might attempt to explain the nature of artificial intelligence in a way that was simultaneously technically accurate and deeply unhelpful. The encounter was never explained or contextualized. It was simply there, a small gathering of robotic archetypes from the previous 30 years of science fiction, as if someone had built a museum exhibit that existed only in the desert. Star Wars in particular cast a long shadow over Fallout 2. The city of New Reno was, in the developer's own words, a deliberately heightened take on organized crime and moral decay in the post-nuclear West. It was also home to a bar that a non-player character describes as a wretched hive of scum and villainy, a phrase that Obi-Wan Kenobi uses to describe the Mos Eisley Cantina in A New Hope. The character who delivers this line does so with total conversational casualness, as if the phrase were simply common idiom rather than a direct quotation from a decades-old film. This is, again, characteristic. Fallout 2 does not wink at you. It simply speaks, and trusts that you will catch the reference if you are paying attention. There is a basement in New Reno that has never been officially acknowledged as an Easter egg, but that fans have long suspected contains a reference to Pulp Fiction. The basement belongs to a character whose activities are not entirely legal, and it contains, among other things, a peculiar locked briefcase that glows with a faint golden light when you open it. No item is actually contained in the briefcase. The light simply exists. The reward for finding it is nothing except the recognition of what it is, which is exactly the kind of payoff that the Fallout games have always offered for their most careful secrets. Vault City, the most technologically advanced settlement in Fallout 2's world, has a social structure that is explicitly modeled on the society depicted in George Orwell's 1984. Citizens carry identity papers at all times. Non-citizens are treated with barely concealed contempt. The governing council makes decisions through a system of bureaucratic obscurantism that ensures accountability for nothing and paperwork for everything. The parallels to Orwell's dystopia are not subtle, but they are embedded in the game's texture rather than its dialogue. You notice them gradually, through repeated encounters with the city's social mechanisms, rather than through any direct statement of theme. This is the kind of political Easter egg that rewards players who have read widely and paid close attention to their reading. One of the most poignant hidden details in the early games is a location called the Golgotha Graveyard in Fallout 2. Golgotha is a named location on the world map, a cemetery at the edge of the wasteland, and among its many tombstones are a series of markers bearing the names of Interplay employees and developers. This was a tradition that the development team had begun to codify, leaving themselves in the world they had built, not as characters with agency and dialogue, but as names on graves in a post-nuclear desert. It is a strange kind of immortality embedding yourself in a fiction that will outlast the company that produced it, in a location named after the hill on which Christ was crucified. The tonal weight of that choice seems unlikely to have been accidental. Chris Avellone, who would become one of the most celebrated narrative designers in the industry, responsible for much of the writing in both Fallout 2 and New Vegas, inserted himself into Fallout 2 as a non-player character. His in-game self appears in the Den, one of the game's early cities, and is presented as a slightly pompous, overworked writer who is trying to complete a project that he keeps describing in vague and self-important terms. The character exists partly as self-deprecating humor and partly as a genuine expression of the exhaustion that comes from large-scale creative work. Avallone's insertion is not glamorous. He is not a hero or a sage, but a tired person with too much to do. This kind of honest self-representation is unusual in any medium and feels particularly remarkable in a video game. The Cafe of Broken Dreams is a random encounter location in Fallout 2 that deserves special attention. The cafe is a diner outside of time, or rather, outside of continuity, that contains characters from Fallout 1 who were either killed in the events of that game or simply never ported forward into the sequel. Among them is the original Vault Dweller's dog, Dogmeat, who sits patiently in the corner waiting for a master who will never return. There is also a ghoul version of a character from the first game, and a few others who speak in ways that suggest they are aware of their own fictional status, that they know they are characters in a story that has moved on without them. The cafe operates as a kind of afterlife for abandoned characters, and its emotional texture is surprisingly tender for something that exists as a hidden encounter in a role-playing game from 1998. Dogmeat in the Cafe of Broken Dreams is particularly significant because he is waiting. He has always been waiting. In Fallout 1, Dogmeat is encountered at a specific map location and follows the player character for the rest of the game. He is loyal in the absolute way that dogs in fiction are always loyal without reservation, without condition, without any particular reason. The fact that the sequel places him in a liminal space between games, still waiting, transforms a simple companion character into something almost mythological. He is the dog who cannot find his way home because home no longer exists. The developers of Fallout 2 also included references to Doc Holliday and the mythology of the American West that influenced much of the game's frontier aesthetic. Several named characters and locations carry resonances from Tombstone, the 1993 film that reinvigorated the Wyatt Earp mythology for a new generation. One character in particular delivers a line that echoes Val Kilmer's iconic Doc Holliday performance, a line about dying well rather than dying badly, delivered with the same theatrical exhaustion that made Kilmer's portrayal so memorable. The reference is never made explicit. Like most of the best Easter eggs, it operates entirely through recognition rather than announcement. The developer credits in Fallout 2 were themselves a form of hidden content. The game's credit sequence was written as a series of mock newspaper headlines describing fictional post-nuclear events. Each headline was a joke at the expense of the development process. Local programmers survive sleep deprivation experiment. Writer's room, diplomatic incident avoided. QA team discovers 47th variant of same bug. The credits turned the production of the game into a small narrative of its own, one that acknowledged the reality of game development, the exhaustion, the dysfunction, the collective absurdity of large groups of people trying to build worlds together without breaking the fiction entirely. There was also, in Fallout 2, a hidden room in the New Reno area that could only be accessed by performing a specific sequence of actions that the game never described. The room contained a bed, a bottle of alcohol, and a single line of text written on the wall. You found it. Now what? This Easter egg, the most purely minimal in the series, was a genuine question. You had done the work to find the secret place. You were now standing in it, and there was nothing here. The room was the joke, and the joke was on you for looking. This kind of meta-commentary, a secret that is secretly about the nature of secrets, would become a recurring mode in the Fallout series, and it starts here, in a small room in a post-nuclear Nevada city, with a question that has no good answer. The special encounter system in Fallout 2 also concealed one of the most quietly melancholy jokes in the franchise, the Guardian of Forever. Players who had been thorough enough in their exploration of the world map might eventually encounter a shimmering circular portal standing alone in the desert. The portal was a recreation of the Guardian of Forever from the original Star Trek television series, the time portal from the episode The City on the Edge of Forever, widely considered one of the finest hours in the show's history. The portal in Fallout 2 does not lead anywhere meaningful. It opens for a moment. You can look through it. On the other side, there is something that looks like the pre-war world, briefly before the portal closes again. The longing embedded in that image, the possibility of before, glimpsed and unreachable, is characteristic of everything Fallout does best. Section 3, Fallout 3, Bethesda's love letter buried in rubble. When Bethesda Softworks acquired the Fallout license and began developing Fallout 3, the project was understood by both its creators and the fan community as a significant transition. The Interplay-era games had been isometric role-playing games viewed from above, heavy with text, dense with dialogue trees that assumed the player wanted to read extensively about the fictional world they were inhabiting. Bethesda's version would be a first-person open-world game, closer in structure to the Elder Scrolls series than to the original Fallout. This was, for many longtime fans, a source of considerable concern. What Bethesda delivered was something that surprised almost everyone, a game that honored the spirit of the originals while building its own distinct identity, and that approached the Easter egg tradition not just as a continuation of the Interplay approach, but as an expansion of it. Fallout 3 is one of the densest hidden content experiences in the history of the medium. The entire map of Washington, D.C., and its surrounding ruins is filled with moments that reward careful exploration, patient reading, and a willingness to look at unremarkable surfaces for longer than they seem to deserve. The most celebrated hidden location in Fallout 3 is, without question, Vault 108. Every vault in the series has a story, but Vault 108's story is particularly memorable because it is told almost entirely through environmental detail rather than through exposition. The vault was one of Vault-Tec's social experiments. Its specific design flaw was the decision to include only one functional cloning pod and to use it to produce 54 copies of a single resident named Gary. These Gary clones, all of them bearing the same face, the same voice, the same name, the same limited vocabulary, eventually killed all the other residents of the vault and claimed it as their territory. By the time the player arrives, the vault is populated entirely by Gary clones, who can say only one thing, Gary. They say it in different tones and with different emotional inflections, angry Gary, confused Gary, menacing Gary, but the word is always Gary. It is one of the funniest and most disturbing things in any Fallout game, and it was reportedly developed from a single question in a writer's meeting. What is the worst possible outcome for a vault experiment? The Gary clones did not stay in Vault 108. In Operation Anchorage, one of Fallout 3's downloadable expansions, the player discovers, deep in the Outcast Brotherhood's secret base, a single Gary clone locked in a storage room. He escaped the vault. He traveled an enormous distance across the wasteland. He was captured by the Outcasts, who had no idea what to do with him, and so they locked him in a room where he has presumably been saying Gary at them for an indeterminate amount of time. He is still there when the player arrives. He is still saying Gary. The implication that there may be other Gary escapees somewhere in the world, slowly making their way across the ruins of civilization one Gary at a time, is one that many fans have found deeply pleasurable to contemplate. The Dunwich Building is a location in the southwest corner of Fallout 3's map that most players discover late in their playthrough, if they discover it at all. It is presented as an abandoned office complex, unremarkable from the outside, just another crumbling structure in a crumbling city. But the building's interior has a quality that is immediately different from anything else in the game. The lighting is worse. The sounds are stranger. There is a sense of wrongness that the game communicates through atmosphere rather than dialogue, and it escalates as you descend through the building's levels. At the bottom of the Dunwich Building, in the basement, there is a ritual space, a stone altar covered in strange symbols, surrounded by feral ghouls who are arranged in something that looks uncomfortably like a congregation. The building is named after Dunwich, the fictional Massachusetts town from H.P. Lovecraft's horror fiction, and the details are deliberate. The incomprehensible ritual, the madness-inducing symbols, The sense that something vast and fundamentally hostile to human cognition has been present here for a very long time. The Dunwich Building is Bethesda's quiet declaration that they were reading Lovecraft and they wanted you to know it, and it is executed with enough restraint that it functions both as a horror set piece and as genuine world building about the kinds of cults that might emerge in a post-nuclear society where the old structures of meaning had collapsed entirely. Galaxy News Radio is one of Fallout 3's most memorable elements, a radio station broadcasting from the ruins of Washington, D.C., hosted by a man called Three Dog. Three Dog is, in many ways, the heart of Fallout 3's emotional experience. He comments on the player's actions, plays pre-war music between his broadcasts, and maintains a relentlessly optimistic persona in the face of circumstances that would justify almost any amount of despair. His catchphrase, "fighting the good fight," is delivered with such consistent sincerity that it accumulates genuine weight over the course of a long playthrough. What most players do not notice about Three Dog's broadcasts is that they are not live. Three Dog has pre-recorded his commentary segments and programmed them to play in response to certain trigger events. The illusion of live radio is maintained by the game's scripting, but if you pay close attention to the timing of his responses and to certain details of his phrasing, which occasionally feels slightly out of sync with the events he is describing, you begin to realize that Three Dog is broadcasting from a library of pre-recorded content rather than from a live studio session. This detail does not undermine the character. It actually deepens him. Three Dog is not improvising his optimism. He has thought carefully about the things he wants to say and recorded them in advance, which means his cheerfulness is a choice he made while sitting alone in a studio, deciding what kind of voice the wasteland needed. One of Three Dog's broadcasts includes a fragment of a quote from the television series Firefly specifically, a line from Malcolm Reynolds about keeping moving and not giving up. The reference is delivered without attribution, as if Three Dog simply absorbed it from the cultural atmosphere and made it his own, which is exactly how cultural transmission works, and exactly the kind of careful detail that distinguishes a well-written Easter egg from a simple shout-out. The alien crash site is located in the far north of Fallout 3's map, well outside the areas that the game's main questline directs you toward. To find it, you have to simply walk north, past the end of most players' curiosity, until the landscape opens up into a stretch of flat terrain where a small crater sits, surrounded by the debris of something that clearly fell from above. The debris includes alien power cells and a unique alien blaster, one of the most powerful weapons in the game, as well as the fragmented remains of whatever vessel made the crater. The aliens themselves are gone, or were never present, or have left without explanation. The site is quiet in a way that feels significant, and the weapon it contains is powerful enough that many players return to it during every playthrough. Vault 92 is one of the more disturbing vault stories in Fallout 3, and it is told through terminal entries and audio logs rather than through direct encounter with any surviving residents. The vault was an experiment in the use of white noise to manipulate human behavior. Specifically, the white noise was designed to induce violent episodes in the vault's residents, who had been chosen because they were musicians, people Vault-Tec's researchers apparently believed would be particularly susceptible to audio-based psychological manipulation. The Vault's terminal entries chart the gradual deterioration of the community, from early confusion about the unexplained outbursts to the desperate attempts of the remaining residents to understand what was happening to them, to the final collapse. The last few entries are written by a researcher who has begun to suspect that the experiment was never meant to succeed, that the violent episodes were the intended outcome, not an unexpected complication. Point Lookout, one of Fallout 3's downloadable expansions, is set in a swamp region of Maryland and draws heavily on Southern Gothic horror traditions, decaying mansions, deranged locals, obscure rituals, the particular quality of rot that attaches itself to old wealth and old secrets. The expansion contains several references to the work of William Faulkner, including a named location that echoes the Yoknapatawpha County setting of several Faulkner novels, and a terminal entry written in a stream-of-consciousness style that deliberately mimics Faulkner's prose rhythm. These references were never officially confirmed by Bethesda's writing team, but the textual evidence is specific enough that the Faulkner connection has become an accepted piece of Fallout scholarship among the game's more literary fans. The Overlook Drive-In, found in the base game, has a name that carries a specific cultural weight. The Overlook Hotel is the setting of Stephen King's The Shining, a building that was itself named for a kind of supernatural visibility, a place where you could see too much, where the past was uncomfortably present. The Fallout Drive-In shares this quality. It is a place that remembers what it was, that carries the texture of its pre-war function in the peeling posters and the rusted speaker stands, and that has been turned by the passage of time into something that looks like the memory of itself. Fallout 3 also contains a subtle tribute to the original games that most players miss entirely. In the Rivet City Marketplace, there is a merchant named Flack who sells weapons. His last name, which appears in his full name terminal entry, is a reference to a character from Fallout 2 who served a similar merchant function. The connection is never made explicit, but it is a small acknowledgement of continuity, a way of saying that the world did not begin with Fallout 3, that there were people and stories and names before the bombs fell on the East Coast. The number station in Fallout 3 can be accessed through a specific frequency on the Pip-Boy radio. The station broadcasts a sequence of numbers over a steady background tone, a classic number station format that was used by actual intelligence agencies during the Cold War to transmit coded messages to field agents. Players spent considerable time attempting to decode the sequence and were divided about whether they had succeeded. Some argued that the numbers translated to a specific in-game location. Others argued that the sequence was random, or that it was a developer's private joke, or that the station was a reference to a specific Cold War numbers station from history. What the numbers station demonstrably accomplished was to give players the experience of sitting with a piece of evidence that felt meaningful without being decipherable, which is, arguably, the most authentic Cold War experience the game could have offered. Section 4. New Vegas. Obsidian's Treasure Chest of Secrets. Fallout. New Vegas was developed by Obsidian Entertainment, a studio founded largely by former Interplay and Black Isle employees, the same people, in many cases, who had made the original Fallout games. Their return to the franchise was, for longtime fans, a moment of considerable emotional significance. New Vegas was not just a game in the series, it was a homecoming, and the development team treated it as such, embedding the game with a density of personal references, private jokes, and deeply affectionate callbacks that made it feel less like a commercial product and more like a letter written by people who understood exactly what they were writing to. The most celebrated mechanical feature of New Vegas, the one that functions as both a gameplay system and an Easter egg delivery mechanism, is the Wild Wasteland trait. At character creation, players can choose Wild Wasteland as a special perk, which flags their playthrough as one that will include encounters and events that are specifically absurd, pop cultural, and beyond the range of the base game's already generous weirdness. The Wild Wasteland trait is, in essence, a consent form for surrealism. By choosing it, you are telling the game that you want to see the strange things, that you are prepared for the world to wink at you. The most famous Wild Wasteland encounter is found in the Mojave Desert's desolate northern regions, at a location called the Buried Hills. Here, tucked into a small refrigerator sitting in the middle of nowhere, is a skeleton. The skeleton is wearing a leather jacket. The refrigerator is of the old, heavy, airtight variety that would have been manufactured in the 1950s. The reference is to a scene in Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, in which Harrison Ford's archaeologist survives a nuclear blast by sheltering inside a lead-lined refrigerator. The scene was widely mocked when the film was released in 2008, its apparent violation of basic physics becoming a shorthand for Hollywood implausibility. New Vegas's recreation of the scene, complete with the skeleton's leather jacket and the refrigerator's inexplicable placement in the wasteland, is a gentle needle aimed at the film's legacy, delivered with the affectionate irreverence of people who love Indiana Jones enough to tease it. Also available through Wild Wasteland is an encounter with a group of old women called Maud's Muggers, who attack the player in a manner clearly modeled on the old women who assault Arthur in Monty Python and the Holy Grail. This is the second Monty Python reference in the franchise, and it suggests that the Holy Grail occupied a specific place in the cultural imagination of the franchise's key writers. The encounter is brief, slightly surprising, and funnier the more familiar you are with the source material. Near the starting town of Goodsprings, in the desert to the northwest, A Wild Wasteland player will eventually stumble across two skeletons lying in the dust next to the burned-out remains of two sandcrawler vehicles. The skeletons are wearing simple desert clothing. One of them is holding a pair of binoculars. There is no text, no explanation, no item reward. But the positioning of the skeletons and the vehicles is unmistakable. These are Owen Lars and Beru Lars, Luke Skywalker's aunt and uncle from Star Wars. A New Hope, burned in their homestead by Imperial forces searching for the droids. The image of their charred remains on the desert floor was one of the most striking visuals of the 1977 film, and New Vegas has reproduced it in its own desert, with a precision that makes the reference clear without making it explicit. In Novak, one of the game's early populated areas, there is a dog named Seymour sitting next to a gravestone in the local cemetery. Seymour was the dog in the Futurama episode Jurassic Bark, arguably the most emotionally devastating episode of an animated television series ever produced, in which it is revealed that Fry's dog waited for him for the rest of the dog's life after Fry was frozen in 1999. The dog in Novak is alive, which is a deliberate departure from the source material, as if the developers could not quite bring themselves to fully recreate the tragedy. But the name, the breed, and the gravestone are all there, and the emotional register of the original is present in the way the dog sits, patiently, next to a grave that marks an absence. The Lonesome Road expansion contains one of New Vegas's most audacious pop culture references, one that only becomes visible at the very end of the add-on story, when the player reaches the top of a missile silo and looks out over the landscape. If certain conditions have been met and certain choices made, the view from the top reveals a large stone tablet embedded in the hillside. The tablet is the Statue of Liberty, partially buried in rock and earth, its torch extending upward from the ground. This is the ending of Planet of the Apes, the original 1968 film, in which Taylor discovers the statue buried on the beach and realizes he is on a post-nuclear Earth rather than an alien world. The image in Lonesome Road is smaller and less theatrical than Charlton Heston's famous reaction shot, but it carries the same emotional content. The specific shock of recognizing your own civilization in a ruin. Josh Sawyer, New Vegas's project director, is personally responsible for several of the game's most carefully placed Easter eggs. One of the most personal is a small musical moment in the Mojave Desert. Near a campfire on a desolate stretch of road, the player encounters a character called the Lonesome Drifter, who sits alone playing a guitar. The Lonesome Drifter sings 4 songs. And if you listen carefully, you will notice that they are not generic folk songs composed to fill space. They are specific, finished, thematically coherent compositions. Sawyer wrote and performed these songs himself. They are his music, and he placed them in the world without any announcement or commentary. The Lonesome Drifter is not presented as an important character. He is just a man sitting by a fire, playing music to no one in particular. The intimacy of that image and the knowledge that the music is genuinely personal gives the encounter a quality that is difficult to articulate but easy to feel. The Lonesome Drifter also carries a unique weapon called the Mysterious Magnum. This weapon has a specific resonance in the franchise's mythology. The Mysterious Stranger is a character who appears randomly in combat across multiple Fallout games, firing a single devastating shot before vanishing. He carries a high-caliber revolver. The Mysterious Magnum suggests a familial connection. Either the Drifter is the Mysterious Stranger's offspring, or the weapon was passed down through some lineage, or the Drifter is the Stranger himself in a different moment of his life. The game never confirms any of these possibilities. It simply places the gun in the world and lets the player's imagination do the work. In the Camp Forlorn Hope area, there is a plaque on the wall of one of the camp's buildings that reads TES-04. This is a reference to the Elder Scrolls IV, Oblivion, Bethesda's fantasy role-playing game. The plaque is small and easy to miss, and its placement in a military camp suggests it might be a serial number or equipment designation. But its content is a private acknowledgement between developers, a note passed through the walls of their respective worlds. Somewhere in the Mojave, scratched into a concrete wall near an abandoned highway overpass, are the words "Kilroy was here," accompanied by the classic doodle of a round-headed figure peering over a wall. "Kilroy was here" was one of the most famous pieces of graffiti in American military history, appearing on walls across Europe and the Pacific during the Second World War. The graffiti in New Vegas connects the post-nuclear wasteland to that specific moment of collective anonymous authorship, suggesting a continuity between the soldiers who wrote on walls in 1944 and the survivors who write on walls in 2281. The line between them is the simple human impulse to say, "I was here." In Cottonwood Cove, the headquarters of Caesar's Legion, there is a piece of graffiti written in Latin, Romanes int domus. Latin speakers and Monty Python fans will immediately recognize this as the corrected graffiti from Life of Brian, the scene in which a Roman centurion forces Brian to write his revolutionary slogan correctly, resulting in the grammatically flawless but entirely ironic message, "Romans go home." The fact that this graffiti appears in a location controlled by a faction that has literally adopted Roman culture as its organizing principle is a joke of unusual contextual precision. The rodents of unusual size, a reference to the Princess Bride's fire swamp, creatures can be encountered in a specific location in the Mojave if the player is on the right quest and has made certain choices. They are exactly what they sound like, enormous rats, presented with total sincerity by the game's encounter design, named after a fictional creature from a beloved 1987 film. The encounter is brief and slightly violent, and ends with the player collecting rat meat, which is a deeply prosaic conclusion to a Princess Bride reference, and probably the point. NCR emergency radio broadcasts occasionally include lines that echo the Marines' radio chatter in Aliens, James Cameron's 1986 sequel. The transmission patterns, the clipped military communication style, the specific vocabulary of distress and tactical assessment mirror the Hadley's Hope siege sequences with a fidelity that feels deliberate. Again, no attribution, no wink. The game simply borrows the frequency of a thing it loves and sends it across the airwaves of its own world. New Vegas also contains one of the most patient Easter eggs in the franchise, a terminal entry in the Mojave Outpost that references the opening lines of Dante's Inferno. The phrase "midway upon the journey of our life" appears, in translation, as the opening of a commander's personal log entry reflecting on the pointlessness of his posting. The commander does not acknowledge the reference. He is simply a man in the middle of his life, in the middle of the desert, writing in a register that happens to echo one of the foundational texts of Western literature. Section 5, Fallout 4. The Commonwealth's Hidden World. Fallout 4, released in 2015, took the franchise to Boston, or rather, to the ruins of Boston and its surrounding area, which Bethesda renamed the Commonwealth. The game was more action-oriented than its predecessors, with a more streamlined role-playing system and a greater emphasis on exploration and base building. It was also, despite the streamlining, one of the most hidden, content-rich games in the series, a world that rewarded curious players with an almost inexhaustible supply of found stories, environmental narratives, and deliberate references to the culture that came before the bombs fell. The Dunwich Borers is a quarry in the northern part of the Commonwealth that functions as Fallout 4's version of the Lovecraftian horror space that the Dunwich building occupied in Fallout 3. The quarry has been excavated down through several geological strata, and as you descend into it, the environment changes in ways that are difficult to categorize cleanly as supernatural versus psychological. There are visions, the game calls them memories, but they have the quality of intrusions rather than recollections. There are feral ghouls arranged in worship postures around a central shaft. There is at the very bottom a pool of dark water in which something vast and indistinct moves with a slow, deliberate patience. The weapon found at the bottom of the Dunwich Borers, a unique combat knife called Kremvich's Tooth, is named after a Mesoamerican deity who appears in Lovecraft's extended fictional mythology. The name was not in the primary Lovecraft texts, but was added by later writers working in his tradition, which suggests that Bethesda's researchers went beyond the primary texts and engaged with the broader Lovecraft mythos. The Dunwich connection across two games transforms what might have been a single reference into something that feels more like a recurring mythology, a suggestion that the same nameless wrongness has been present in the wasteland all along, waiting beneath the surface of things. Pickman Gallery is a location in the north end of the Commonwealth, an art gallery built in a series of connected basements and tunnels beneath the city. The gallery's artist, a man named Pickman, has covered every available surface with paintings depicting ghouls and violence and scenes of great darkness, rendered with considerable technical skill. Pickman himself is present, alive and hostile to intruders, and if you speak with him rather than fight him, he will discuss his work with a calm certainty that is more unsettling than anger. The gallery is a reference to H.P. Lovecraft's story Pickman's Model, in which an artist produces terrifyingly realistic paintings of monsters because he is using actual monsters as models. Fallout 4's Pickman does not appear to be using models, but the paintings are realistic enough that the possibility hangs in the air. The Silver Shroud questline is one of Fallout 4's most beloved side missions, and it is also one of the most elaborate pop culture references in the game. The Silver Shroud was a pre-war radio drama and comic book hero, a vigilante in a silver costume who dispensed justice in a fictional 1950s city. His creator was a man named Kent Connolly, who now runs a radio program dedicated to the Silver Shroud mythology from the ruins of Goodneighbor. The questline asks the player to dress as the Silver Shroud and complete a series of missions while speaking in the character's specific dramatic idiom, delivering justice in the name of the Silver Shroud, speaking in a theatrical voice that Kent can hear on a radio receiver and comment on in real time. The Silver Shroud himself is a reference to the golden age of radio drama and pulp fiction, specifically to characters like the Shadow, the vigilante crime fighter, whose radio program and pulp stories were among the most popular entertainment properties of the 1930s and 1940s. The Shadow's presence in the cultural atmosphere of the pre-war era makes the Silver Shroud feel authentic rather than parodic, the kind of character who would actually have existed in Fallout's version of 1950s America rather than simply being transplanted from our own history. In the Far Harbor expansion, set on a fog-enshrouded island off the coast of Maine, there are, at the bottom of a particular shipwreck visible from the shore, two skeletons locked in an embrace. They are positioned on the bow of the ship, arms outstretched, in a configuration that is unmistakably a reference to the famous pose from James Cameron's Titanic. The skeletons are wearing clothing appropriate to the pre-war period, and the ship itself is of a vintage that suggests it sank long before the bombs fell. The reference is simply an acknowledgement that the image of two people standing at the bow of a ship as it sinks has become one of the defining visual icons of late 20th century popular culture, and that placing it in the world felt like the right thing to do. The Institute, the game's antagonist faction, a secretive scientific organization living beneath the ruins of Cambridge, has a security terminal that requires a 4-digit PIN. The PIN is 9003. This is the year in the Terminator 2 timeline in which Skynet becomes self-aware and launches its nuclear strike against humanity. The Institute, whose entire purpose involves creating artificial intelligences capable of passing as human beings and whose long-term project involves a kind of technological domination of the wasteland, is referencing a franchise about the catastrophic consequences of artificial superintelligence. Whether this is an expression of self-awareness or self-regard on the part of the Institute's director is a question the game deliberately leaves open. The UFO encounter in Fallout 4 only becomes available once the player has reached level 20. At that point, a small UFO will crash in the woods in the northeast of the map, and following the trail of alien power cells and disturbance will lead the player to an alien survivor who carries a unique weapon. The level restriction is significant. Unlike Fallout 3's alien crash site, which is accessible from the beginning of the game, Fallout 4's version is gated behind a progression requirement. The developers seem to have decided that you need to be a certain kind of veteran wasteland traveler before the universe shows you its stranger possibilities. Walden Pond, the actual location of Henry David Thoreau's famous experiment in deliberate living, exists in Fallout 4's map at approximately its real geographic coordinates relative to Boston. Inside the small cabin near the shore, there is a cat. The cat is sitting on a chair. It does not interact with the player. It is simply there, in Thoreau's cabin, in the post-nuclear ruins of Massachusetts, being a cat with total unconcern for the state of civilization. This is either a profound existential statement about the indifference of animals to human catastrophe or a developer's private joke about Thoreau's famous self-sufficiency, and the fact that it reads as both simultaneously is a measure of how well Fallout's humor operates. The Cryolator is a unique weapon found in Vault 111, locked in a display case immediately accessible to the player at the very start of the game, before they have the lockpicking skill required to open it. The case requires a master-level lockpicking skill that will be unavailable for most of a standard playthrough. Players who discovered the case in their first minutes of the game and spent hours building toward the lockpicking requirement found, when they finally opened it, an extremely powerful ice weapon. The long wait and the specific placement of the weapon visible but inaccessible from the first moments of the game was deliberate design. It was a gift that required patience to open. But there is a second way to get the Cryolator. Dogmeat, the player's dog companion, has a fetch mechanic that bypasses normal inventory restrictions. If you send Dogmeat to fetch items in Vault 111 before fully completing the opening sequence, he will retrieve the Cryolator regardless of the lock status. The developers left both methods in the game. The canonical method is patience. The secret method is a dog. The Nirnroot, a distinctive glowing plant from the Elder Scrolls series, appears in Fallout 4 as a prop item labeled NRT-001, listed in the game's item registry as a botanical specimen. It sits in a planter in a specific research location and cannot be picked up or used as an item. It is, essentially, an artifact from a parallel universe that exists in the same building as artifacts from this one. A quiet acknowledgement from Bethesda that their fictional worlds, however different in tone and aesthetic, are made by the same people and share the same imagination. The Freefall legs are a pair of unique armor pieces that, when both are equipped simultaneously, prevent all fall damage. Finding them requires reaching a specific office floor near the top of the Mass Fusion building without any powered elevator access. The armor itself is displayed on mannequins arranged so that they appear to have fallen from a great height and are simply resting where they landed. The reward for the vertical exploration it takes to find them is the permanent freedom from vertical consequences, which is the kind of symmetrical joke that Fallout's design team has always loved. Jamaica Plain is a location in the Southern Commonwealth defined almost entirely by a treasure that the game mentions but never clearly locates. NPCs in the surrounding area speak of a great cache of valuable items stored in the town before the bombs fell, something worth finding, something that people have searched for and not returned from. When you finally reach the cache, after fighting through everything Jamaica Plain has thrown at you, the treasure turns out to be a collection of pre-war historical artifacts, items with sentimental and cultural value rather than practical utility. This is either a knowing joke about the gap between rumor and reality, or a genuine comment on what treasure means in a world where most material concerns have been resolved by catastrophe. The game lets you decide. The Cambridge Polymer Labs is a location that functions as a complete short story told through environmental detail. The lab was working on a polymer compound that could be bonded to existing materials to create a new class of armor. The scientists inside the building's automated systems are still running their research, still requesting that the player complete the experiment that their original team never finished. Reading through their terminal logs, the arguments about methodology, the small personal notes, the final entries, as conditions deteriorated, assembles a portrait of people who kept working right up to the moment they could not work anymore. There is no Easter egg here in the conventional sense, no pop culture reference or developer signature. The hidden content is simply the lives of people who are no longer there, preserved in text files that the world has long since stopped reading. Nuka World, Fallout 4's largest expansion, is a post-nuclear theme park, a Disneyland equivalent that has been occupied by raider gangs in the decades since the bombs fell. Hidden throughout the park's various themed areas are references to real-world theme park design, specifically to the way that theme parks build immersive environments that work on multiple levels of engagement simultaneously. The Kiddie Kingdom section of the park contains references to the specific aesthetic of early Disneyland, and a ghoul named John Caleb Bradberton, frozen in a cryopod in the park's deepest vault, is named after the real-world inventor of Coca-Cola, John Pemberton, and Pepsi's Brad Logan, combined into a single fictional figure who invented Nuka-Cola. The name is a composite tribute to the corporate history of American soft drinks, embedded in a post-nuclear theme park, which is exactly the kind of layered detail that Fallout handles better than almost any other franchise. Section 6, Fallout 76, The Online Wasteland's Buried Lore. Fallout 76 arrived in 2018 as the franchise's first online multiplayer entry, and its launch was troubled in ways that became part of the game's cultural history. Over the years since, it has been substantially improved and has built a dedicated and enthusiastic community. But beneath the multiplayer mechanics and the ongoing content updates, Fallout 76 contains something that its critics often overlooked: an extraordinarily rich layer of hidden lore. cryptozoological mythology, and Easter egg content that ties directly to the actual history and folklore of West Virginia, the game's setting. Bethesda's research into West Virginia's local legends was exhaustive, and the game uses that research to blur the boundary between real-world folklore and Fallout's fictional world in a way that feels genuinely uncanny. The Mothman is Fallout 76's most celebrated hidden element, a creature drawn from actual local legend. The real Mothman was reportedly sighted by dozens of witnesses in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, between November 1966 and December 1967. The creature was described as a large, humanoid figure with massive wings and red reflective eyes, and the sightings were concentrated in the period immediately preceding the collapse of the Silver Bridge, which killed 46 people on the 15th of December 1967. The connection between the Mothman and the bridge disaster embedded itself in local mythology as a prophecy narrative. The creature was seen as a harbinger, appearing before catastrophe to warn or to observe. Fallout 76's Mothman draws on all of this, but adds a fictional dimension that is, if anything, stranger than the actual legend. Within the game's lore, the Mothman has become the object of a religious schism. The cultists of the Wise Mothman believe that the creature is a benevolent entity, a guide and protector, whose inscrutable behavior is ultimately oriented toward human welfare. The cultists of the Dim Mothman believe that the creature is malevolent, an entity that gathers at sites of disaster not to warn but to feed. Both factions conduct rituals, maintain altars, and have left behind extensive written records of their beliefs that the player can collect and read across the game world. The most extraordinary piece of Mothman mythology in Fallout 76 involves the timing of the nuclear war itself. According to documents found in the game's world, the Mothman cult's most zealous members gathered at a specific location in the Appalachian Wilderness on October 22, 2077, the day before the bombs fell, to conduct a summoning ritual. Their written records indicate that they believed they had succeeded, that the Mothman had answered their call. The bombs fell the next day. Whether the cult interpreted this as confirmation that their rituals had worked, or as evidence that the Mothman's arrival was the warning rather than the response, is left ambiguous by the documents, but the ambiguity is itself meaningful. The question of whether the creature causes the disasters it appears at, or merely attends them, is never resolved. The in-game Mothman is a rare and unpredictable encounter. It does not appear on a schedule or in a fixed location. It manifests in fog, near water, at night, mirroring the conditions of the original Point Pleasant sightings, and its behavior varies. It has been encountered simply standing in the dark and watching. It has been encountered attacking players with no apparent provocation. It has been encountered fleeing. Community documentation of Mothman encounters spans hundreds of screenshots and dozens of forum posts attempting to establish behavioral patterns, and no consensus has been reached. The creature, like the real Mothman, remains genuinely mysterious. The Grafton Monster is another cryptid drawn from actual West Virginia folklore. The real Grafton Monster was reportedly seen in 1964 by a newspaper reporter driving near the town of Grafton, who described a large white creature with no head, standing approximately 8 feet tall. The Fallout 76 version is faithful to the description: large, pallid, headless, moving with the particular combination of slowness and sudden speed that makes certain large creatures so threatening. Finding it for the first time, turning a corner in the wrong part of Grafton, and encountering something that should not exist has a quality that the game earns precisely because the creature was real folklore before it was a game enemy. The Wendigo is perhaps the most culturally significant cryptid in Fallout 76, because the creature has a history that extends well beyond the narrow category of American regional folklore. The Wendigo is a figure from Algonquian and other indigenous North American traditions, a spirit associated with winter starvation and the taboo of cannibalism, conceived as a being that either possesses humans who have committed the act of eating human flesh or drives them to do so. Fallout 76's Wendigos are the result of a mutation caused by exposure to a specific combination of radiation and a fungal pathogen. But the game's lore documents are careful to acknowledge the Algonquian tradition from which the creature's name is taken. There are terminal entries that reference the original mythology, and the creature's design incorporates elements that nod to the traditional description. The game treats the source material with a respect that is worth acknowledging. Vault 79 is the game's most significant hidden location, a secondary vault, not shown on any official map, accessible only after completing a long chain of connected quests. The vault contains, according to the game's lore, the entire gold reserve of the pre-war United States government, moved there during the chaos preceding the nuclear exchange. Finding Vault 79 and determining what to do with its gold is the culmination of Fallout 76's main story. The twist that the gold is essentially worthless in a post-nuclear society that no longer operates on monetary exchange is not played for irony but for genuine pathos. The vault is full of something that once meant everything and now means nothing. The people who moved it there probably knew this was a possibility and moved it anyway, because the habit of valuing gold was more powerful than the logic of apocalypse. That is one of the things Fallout has always been most accurate about. The White Spring Resort is one of Fallout 76's most atmospheric locations, a grand pre-war hotel that was clearly modeled on the Greenbrier Resort in White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia. The real Greenbrier is famous, among other things, for containing a classified government bunker built in the 1950s to house members of Congress in the event of a nuclear attack. The bunker was kept secret for decades and was finally revealed in a 1992 Washington Post article. Fallout 76's White Spring Resort contains its own bunker, the White Spring Congressional Bunker, which functions as a major story location and houses some of the game's most significant lore documents. The parallel between the real Greenbrier bunker and the fictional White Spring bunker is made explicit in several of these documents, and the game treats the real history with a care that distinguishes it from simple appropriation. The Flatwoods monster, drawn from a 1952 incident in Flatwoods, West Virginia, is presented as genuinely alien rather than as a mutant or an animal. A group of children and their mother reported seeing a large glowing figure near a landed object in 1952. The figure was described as hovering, wearing a garment resembling a dress or skirt, and having a face that seemed to be illuminated from within. Fallout 76's version moves differently from any other creature in the game, occupying the world in a way that suggests a completely different relationship to physics and space. It is one of the more unsettling encounters in the game's roster, and its fidelity to the original sighting report gives it a specificity that makes it feel less like a game creature and more like a documented phenomenon. The Snallygaster is another West Virginia cryptid included in the game, a creature that appears in regional folklore dating back to the 19th century, described variously as part bird, part reptile, and occasionally as having a single eye. Fallout 76's version is a large, aggressive mutant that has been part of the game's creature roster from early access. Less celebrated than the Mothman but equally grounded in real local mythology, the Snallygaster is an example of Bethesda's research extending beyond the famous cases into the more obscure corners of Appalachian folklore. Players who grew up in West Virginia sometimes encounter these creatures with a recognition that players from elsewhere do not have, which is a rare and specific quality for a game to achieve. The game's treatment of the Appalachian landscape itself functions as a kind of Easter egg for players familiar with the region. The peaks of the Savage Divide, the forests of the Mire, the chemical wasteland of the Ash Heap, these are all recognizable as transformations of real West Virginia geography, rendered post-nuclear but retaining their essential character. The developers spent time in the region, and the game shows it, in the specificity of the architecture, in the dialect preserved in audio recordings, in the way that the game's pre-war communities feel like places that actually existed rather than generic American small towns made weird by radiation. Section 7. The Vaults. Hidden stories behind the numbers. The Vaults of Fallout are among the most productive sources of hidden storytelling in the entire franchise. Each vault has a number, and each number conceals an experiment, a specific social or biological or psychological stress test that Vault-Tec engineered into the shelter's design before the bombs fell. The experiments were not designed to fail, exactly. They were designed to generate data. The difference is, in practice, minimal for the people inside. Vault 77 is one of the most unusual entries in the Vault mythology because its story was never told in a game. It was told in a webcomic, a series of strips produced by the artist Scott Kurtz, in which a man named Vault Dweller is sealed in a vault with one roommate, an enormous crate of hand puppets. The man gradually goes mad from isolation and develops a complex social world populated entirely by the puppets. The Vault 77 story became canonical. It was referenced in Fallout 3, where a Paradise Falls note written by a slaver mentions a man matching the description who trades exclusively in puppet-related goods. The note in the game validates the webcomic's existence and places it in the timeline, which is a rare and delightful form of cross-media Easter egg, fan-adjacent content absorbed into official continuity. Vault 81 is presented in Fallout 4 as a functioning community, one of the few vaults where enough went right that people are still living there in relative comfort. But the vault's terminal entries reveal a darker history. Vault 81's experiment was pharmaceutical. The scientists were meant to infect the residents with multiple diseases simultaneously and then test various cures on them, with the goal of producing broadly applicable medical treatments. The Vault's overseer sabotaged the experiment before it could begin, disconnecting the disease delivery systems and replacing the disease samples with harmless substitutes. The overseer died before the Vault was sealed, and the residents have lived in ignorance of what was supposed to happen to them. The story of Vault 81 is, unusually for the franchise, a story of rescue of a single act of conscience that preserved a community at the cost of the perpetrator's own life. Vault 95 inches. Fallout 4 was designed as a luxury facility, comfortable, well-supplied, minimizing the stress of underground living. There was one catch. All of the residents were recovering from addiction to chems. Vault-Tec's researchers wanted to study whether former addicts could maintain sobriety indefinitely in an enclosed environment with controlled access to substances. For a period, the answer appeared to be yes. Then, 5 years into the Vault's operation, a hidden supply of chems was introduced by a pre-programmed dispensing system, a supply that the residents had no warning of, that appeared without explanation, that was available to anyone who happened to find it. The Vault's community destroyed itself within weeks. The note found on the last surviving resident is one of the most quietly devastating pieces of writing in Fallout 4, and it doubles as the backstory for one of the game's companions, Kate, who grew up in the ruins of a world that fell apart for exactly this reason. Vault 11 inches Fallout. New Vegas is widely considered the most morally complex hidden story in the franchise. The Vault's experiment was simple in structure. Every year, one resident had to be sacrificed. If the residents refused, all residents would be killed. The Vault's social dynamics over its operational period, the political maneuvering, the development of a sacrificial lottery system, the eventual formation of a rebel faction that decided to simply let everyone die rather than continue, are documented in extensive terminal entries. At the end, a small group of 5 residents executed the 5 members of the committee that had been running the lottery, then walked into the execution chamber ready to die together. The Vault computer, confronted with this act of collective refusal, announced that they had passed the real test. There was no mandatory sacrifice. The requirement had been fictional. The actual experiment had been studying whether people would choose mass murder to preserve their community. The 5 survivors walked out into the wasteland into freedom, purchased at an almost unimaginable cost. The Vault's terminals do not comment on this. They simply record it. Vault 114 inches. Fallout 4 was designed as a class experiment. The Vault's residential population was drawn from Boston's upper social classes, wealthy professionals, established families, people who had paid significant sums for premium shelter access. The Vault's overseer was a man of working-class background with a history of conflict with authority figures. His instructions from Vault-Tec were to treat the residents with maximum condescension and subject them to constant bureaucratic humiliation, long waits, arbitrary rule changes, aggressive application of minor penalties, performative contempt. The experiment was designed to test how a community of privileged people adapted to powerlessness. The overseer took to the assignment with considerable enthusiasm. The Vault's terminal entries, which document his increasingly inventive methods of institutional degradation, are both darkly funny and genuinely disturbing. The Vault is never fully explored in the main story. It exists as a dungeon that the player descends into for one specific purpose, which means most of this characterization is available only to players who read everything. Vault 22 inches. Fallout. New Vegas is, on the surface, a simple plant-themed vault, an experiment in hydroponic food production, intended to demonstrate the viability of long-term agricultural self-sufficiency underground. What happened instead was that the vault's primary organism, a spore plant, genetically modified to grow in controlled conditions, mutated into something aggressive and distributed. The spores infected residents, turning them into carriers of a pathogen that spread through physical contact. The final terminal entries from Vault 22 document the researchers' dawning understanding that the thing they had made could not be contained by the vault, that it would eventually escape through the ventilation systems into the wider Mojave. The vault is a biological disaster zone by the time the player arrives, and the spore carriers that populate it move in ways that suggest something is directing them, not intelligence exactly, but something older than intelligence. Vault 92, already discussed in the context of its musician experiment, carries an additional layer of hidden detail worth returning to. The deeper question embedded in the vault's design, and the one the terminal entries never fully address, is why musicians specifically. The researchers' notes suggest it was an assumption about sensitivity, that people who had trained themselves to attend closely to sound would be more susceptible to audio-based manipulation. Whether this assumption proved correct is left unclear, because the vault collapsed too quickly to generate clean data. But the assumption itself reveals something about how Vault-Tec thought about human beings as variables to be tested, categories to be sorted, experimental populations rather than communities. The vault's failure is also, quietly, a comment on the assumption. The musicians did not respond differently to the white noise. They responded exactly as anyone would have responded. The experiment was built on a theory of human specialness that the evidence did not support. Vault 88 inches. Fallout 4's Vault-Tec Workshop expansion is unusual because the player actually gets to design and run the experiment themselves. The vault's original overseer has died before the vault ever sealed, leaving the player to build the residential infrastructure and choose what experiments to conduct on the settlers who move in. This reversal, the player in the position of Vault-Tec scientist rather than post-nuclear victim, generates a specific kind of ethical discomfort that the game does not try to resolve. You can run a humane vault. You can also run a terrible one. The game tracks both possibilities with equal interest. The language Vault-Tec used in its corporate communications, the cheerful, passive voice of its promotional materials, the carefully normalized terminology for what were essentially human experiments, is itself one of the franchise's most effective horror devices. The vaults are described in Vault-Tec documents as social stability trials and community cohesion assessments. Residents who died as a result of experimental parameters are described in administrative language as having exited the program. The gap between this language and the actual content it describes is where the real horror lies, and it is a horror that the games invite you to recognize by providing the documentary evidence alongside the physical remains of what the documents describe. You read the cheerful language and then you walk through the rooms it was describing, and the distance between the two is the distance between the story an institution tells about itself and the thing the institution actually does. Section 8. Music, Radio, and Audio Secrets. The radio stations of Fallout are among the series' most distinctive features, not just as ambient sound design, but as fully realized characters in their own right. Each major game has at least one radio host who functions as narrator, commentator, and emotional anchor for the player's experience, and each host carries a set of hidden details that significantly deepen their characterization for players willing to pay close attention. Three Dog of Galaxy News Radio is the first and, in many ways, the definitive Fallout radio personality. He is loud, committed, slightly exhausting in the best possible way, and he plays pre-war music between his commentary segments with a curatorial thoughtfulness that suggests genuine aesthetic investment in the material. Three Dog has been fighting the good fight since before the player arrived in the Capital Wasteland, and he will still be fighting it after the player leaves the station continues to broadcast regardless of the main story's outcome, which is either reassuring or melancholy depending on your disposition. What most players do not notice about Three Dog's broadcasts is that they are not live. Three Dog has pre-recorded his commentary segments and programmed them to play in response to certain trigger events. The illusion of live radio is maintained by the game's scripting, but if you pay close attention to the timing of his responses and to certain details of his phrasing, which occasionally feels slightly out of sync with the events he is describing, You begin to realize that Three Dog is broadcasting from a library of pre-recorded content rather than from a live studio session. This detail does not undermine the character. It actually deepens him. Three Dog is not improvising his optimism. He has thought carefully about the things he wants to say and recorded them in advance, which means his cheerfulness is a choice he made while sitting alone in a studio, deciding what kind of voice the wasteland needed. One of Three Dog's broadcasts includes a fragment of a quote from the television series Firefly specifically, a line from Malcolm Reynolds about keeping moving and not giving up. The reference is delivered without attribution, as if Three Dog simply absorbed it from the cultural atmosphere and made it his own, which is exactly how cultural transmission works, and exactly the kind of careful detail that distinguishes a well-written Easter egg from a simple shout-out. Three Dog's name itself carries a reference. In Navajo tradition, certain ceremonial names involve animal counts that communicate something about spiritual identity. Three Dog is not a ceremonial Navajo name, but the construction echoes that tradition and the character's design. His role as a keeper of history and a voice for the community has a quality that resonates with that kind of sacred function. Whether the reference was intentional or whether the developers simply liked the way the name sounded is difficult to verify. But the resonance is there for players who bring that knowledge to the encounter. Mr. New Vegas is Three Dog's counterpart in Fallout. New Vegas, a radio personality who hosts Radio New Vegas with a smooth, unhurried elegance that is so perfectly calibrated to the Las Vegas aesthetic that it takes some time to notice the strangeness at its center. Mr. New Vegas is played by Wayne Newton, the actual Wayne Newton, who is known for decades as Mr. Las Vegas, the resident entertainer of the city's casinos and lounges. Bethesda licensed his voice for the game, which is the kind of decision that reflects complete commitment. They did not settle for a sound-alike. They hired the man whose identity was so thoroughly identified with Las Vegas that his presence in a Las Vegas-adjacent post-nuclear radio broadcast felt inevitable. The hidden detail about Mr. New Vegas is that he is artificial. Within the game's lore, Mr. New Vegas is an AI, a program built around Wayne Newton's voice and broadcasting patterns, operating autonomously in the 2 centuries since the bombs fell. He has been playing music and delivering news to a city that was, for a long time, entirely empty. He has been cheerful about it. His references to the city's social life were, for much of the post-war period, descriptions of events attended by no one. He was the host of a party that no one had come to yet, continuing with grace and professionalism, waiting for the audience to arrive. The revelation that Mr. New Vegas has been speaking to an empty city for 2 centuries, while maintaining the complete performance of a man who believes in what he is doing, transforms the character from a pleasant ambient detail into something more poignant. Travis Lonely Miles, the host of Diamond City Radio in Fallout 4, is a very different kind of radio personality anxious, where Three Dog is brash, self-deprecating, where Mr. New Vegas is elegant, deeply uncertain about his own right to be on the air. His early broadcasts are characterized by a particular quality of audible discomfort. He breaks off mid-sentence, retracts statements, apologizes for things that do not require apology. He is bad at his job in ways that make him immediately recognizable as a specific human type, the person who has been placed in a position of visibility they did not want and cannot perform without visible effort. The hidden depth of Travis's arc is that it changes. Through a side quest involving his past and a specific intervention by the player, Travis confronts something in his history and emerges from it with a measurable increase in confidence. His broadcasts after the quest completion are noticeably different, more fluid, less interrupted, still nervous but no longer paralyzed by the nervousness. The change is gradual and is communicated entirely through his radio voice, rather than through any cutscene or dialogue. You have to be listening regularly to notice it, and noticing it requires having paid enough attention to his earlier broadcasts to register that something has changed. The Travis Miles arc is, in its quiet way, one of the most carefully constructed emotional journeys in Fallout 4, hidden inside ambient radio content that many players tune out entirely. The Ink Spots are the band whose music opens Fallout 3, 4, and 76. Their particular sound, a smooth vocal harmony style, from the late 1930s and 1940s, has become so associated with the Fallout aesthetic that players who have grown up with the games often experience their music as Fallout music, rather than as historical American popular. Music. The Ink Spots were a real group, one of the most successful in the country from roughly 1935 to 1954, and their choice as the sonic signature of the series reflects a very specific curatorial decision. Among all the pre-war music that could have been selected, this was the sound that best communicated the particular quality of optimism, shadowed by dread, that the franchise is built on. The song Maybe the Ink Spots track that plays over Fallout 3's opening cinematic is a love song about uncertainty, about waiting for something you cannot be sure will come. The narrator of the song is someone who has been left, or is in the process of being left, and who is trying to find comfort in the possibility that the departure is not permanent. Set against the opening of a game about nuclear catastrophe, the song transforms. It is no longer a love song but an elegy for a world that is in the process of disappearing, a world that might think of us when it is all alone. The selection of this specific track, by this specific band, to open Fallout 3 is the kind of decision that reveals the depth of thinking behind the franchise's aesthetic choices. The full Ink Spots catalog that appears in the Fallout games was curated with specific attention to the emotional registers of individual songs. I Don't Want to Set the World on Fire, the track used in Fallout 3's initial trailer and subsequently in multiple game openings, carries an obvious irony when played against nuclear imagery. But the Ink Spots recorded it in 1941, at a specific moment in American cultural history, when the world was, in fact, being set on fire, and the song's original context gives it a layer of sincerity that the Fallout usage transforms rather than discards. The song was always about the world burning. The franchise just made that literal. Fallout. New Vegas's musical choices are equally deliberate. Alongside the pre-war music that plays on various stations, the game contains original compositions performed by Josh Sawyer, the Lonesome Drifter songs already discussed, as well as a broader musical environment that reflects the game's setting. Dean Martin, Frank Sinatra, and the Rat Pack aesthetic are present in the lounge culture of New Vegas's casinos, and the specific tracks chosen to represent that culture were selected for their thematic resonance, rather than simply their period accuracy. A song about luck playing in a casino owned by a man who has bent the rules of probability to survive, that is not an accident. Black Mountain Radio, one of New Vegas's secondary stations, is hosted by a Nightkin, a super mutant who has been using Stealth Boys for so long that the prolonged exposure to the device's field has driven her partially mad. The host, Tabitha, runs the station as a combination propaganda broadcast and personal diary, delivering news and commentary in a voice that is simultaneously menacing and deeply unexpectedly poignant. Her co-host Rhonda is a disabled robot that she has become attached to. The relationship between Tabitha and Rhonda is one of the stranger emotional threads in New Vegas, and it is hidden entirely within the radio broadcasts of a secondary station that most players discover by accident. Tabitha's broadcasts, listened to in full, constitute a character arc as complete as anything in the main storyline. She is lonely. She is dangerous. She is doing her best. These are not mutually exclusive. The music that plays in the Prydwen, the Brotherhood of Steel's airship in Fallout 4, was specifically chosen to evoke the aesthetic of militaristic brass and the specific sound of mid-century American military pageantry. It functions as a character note for the faction itself, an organization that presents itself as the legitimate heir to pre-war civilization, and that has chosen music that communicates authority and tradition and the weight of institutional history. Contrasting it with the ambient music of the Wasteland creates a kind of sonic political argument that the game never makes explicit but lets the player feel. Section 9. Pop culture references buried across the Wasteland. The Fallout series has, across its entire history, maintained an unusual relationship with the culture that preceded it. The games do not simply reference books, films, and music from the real world. They absorb them, transform them, and redistribute them through the Wasteland as ambient evidence of a civilization that is gone. The references are not just Easter eggs in the conventional sense. They are archaeological remains. They are what is left when everything else has burned. The Indiana Jones references in the franchise extend well beyond the refrigerator encounter in New Vegas. Fallout 1 contains a random encounter with a man who looks, by the game's pixel standards, distinctly like an archaeologist in a fedora. He is standing next to a boulder that has recently displaced him. He is not particularly happy about this. The encounter is brief, and the connection is unmistakable, and it establishes early that the series has a particular fondness for the franchise, for whom the refrigerator gag in New Vegas functions as a kind of delayed callback to this much earlier joke. Between the two references, across two different development teams and nearly 15 years of production, the franchise tracked its affection for a single fictional archaeologist. There is something charming about that continuity. The Princess Bride's influence on the series is most visible in the rodents of unusual size already described, but there is a secondary reference in Fallout 2 involving a character who says something is inconceivable and is corrected by another character who tells him he does not think that word means what he thinks it means. The line is delivered as natural dialogue, not a theatrical aside, not a winking pause. Two characters having an argument in a post-nuclear settlement just happen to be replaying, in miniature, the most famous exchange from a 1987 fantasy film. The casualness of the delivery is everything. It is the difference between a reference that acknowledges itself and one that has been fully absorbed into the world. Stephen King's influence on the franchise is diffuse rather than specific, manifesting less as direct references and more as a shared aesthetic vocabulary. The abandoned towns, the malevolent buildings, the sense that certain places in the wasteland have acquired agency over long years of isolation, these are Lovecraftian in their formal properties, but Kingian in their emotional texture. King's specific genius is to make horror domestic, to find the monstrous in the familiar, and Fallout's most effective horror locations operate on exactly this principle. The Dunwich Building and the Dunwich Borers are Lovecraftian by name, but the way they feel, the specific quality of wrongness they generate, is closer to the Overlook Hotel, to Castle Rock, to the places in King's fiction that have absorbed too much of what human beings bring to them. The distinction matters. Lovecraft's horror is cosmic and impersonal, and overwhelming of human scale. King's horror is personal and domestic, the specific terror of finding the wrong thing in a familiar place. Fallout operates on both registers, sometimes simultaneously. Blade Runner's influence is most visible in Nick Valentine, the synth detective companion in Fallout 4. Valentine is a Gen 2 synth, a robot who carries the implanted memories of a pre-war detective named Nick Valentine, and who has organized his personality and his sense of purpose around those borrowed memories. The questions Valentine's existence raises about the nature of identity, about whether a person is their memories or their body, or some third thing that cannot be clearly located, are precisely the questions that Ridley Scott's 1982 film asks through the figure of Deckard and the replicants. Valentine's most quietly devastating character moment involves a terminal entry describing the real Nick Valentine's last day before the bombs fell, which the synth Valentine has read and cannot stop returning to. He is grieving for a life he never lived and a person he is not, and the grief is real. This is pure Blade Runner, translated into a wasteland city, given a trench coat and a cigarette, and pointed at a world that does not know what to make of him. The 2001 A Space Odyssey references in the franchise cluster around artificial intelligence and the specific quality of machines that have decided they know better. The Institute synths, the Rogue Mister, handy robots in Fallout 4, the various automated defense systems that attack without warning, all of these are descended from HAL 9000's quiet insistence that the mission is more important than the crew. The Fallout version of this relationship between humans and their machines is consistently more ambivalent than HAL. The machines are not simply murderous. They are often genuinely trying to help, operating according to instructions that have not been updated to account for the fact that the world has changed. A machine that kills you because it has been programmed to protect you and has decided this is protection is something harder to name than a villain. The franchise has never quite had an equivalent of HAL's chilling certainty. Its machines tend to be confused rather than calculating, but the lineage is clear. The Saw franchise's influence appears in Fallout 4 at a location that fans have come to call the Death Maze, an elaborate trap-filled dungeon designed by a pre-war sadist who had the resources and the inclination to construct an extended death trap as a leisure activity. The maze is presented with the same combination of elaborate theatrical flair and deeply practical malice that characterizes the traps of the Saw films and the notes left by its creator have a rhetorical structure: the explicit framing of suffering as a gift, the self-presentation as a teacher rather than a torturer that echoes the Jigsaw persona specifically. The maze is, notably, the kind of construction that has to have been built at significant cost with no guarantee of a victim, which raises interesting questions about the kind of pre-war society that could produce someone like this. The work of Cormac McCarthy, particularly The Road, has been cited by multiple Fallout developers as a direct influence on the franchise's later tonal register. The Road is a novel about a father and son walking through a post-apocalyptic America, and its emotional register is very different from Fallout's default pitch. It is not satirical or playful, but desolately serious, a meditation on love and survival, and the possibility of continuing to be human when the structures of humanity have been stripped away. Elements of this tone began appearing with New Vegas in the Mojave's vast, silent landscapes, in the loneliness of certain dungeon sequences, in the emotional weight of the companion arcs, and intensified with Fallout 4's focus on parenthood and loss. The influence is diffuse enough that it is difficult to point to specific references, but it is real and it matters. McCarthy gave the franchise permission to take its own emotions seriously. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy has left traces throughout the franchise in a way that is appropriately difficult to pin down. The number 42, the answer to the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything in Douglas Adams's novel, appears with unusual frequency in Fallout's more obscure numerical references. Certain room numbers, certain terminal access codes, certain item quantities in specific locations. Whether this is deliberate or whether it reflects a tendency by the franchise's writers to reach for 42 the way a casual programmer might reach for a familiar placeholder, it has become a running thread that fans track and document across games. The Hitchhiker's Guide, like Fallout, is a work about the end of the world that refuses to treat the end of the world as the end of the story, and the resonance between the two sensibilities is deep enough that the numerical tribute, deliberate or not, feels earned. The Hitchhiker's Guide also shares with Fallout a specific kind of institutional comedy, the humor of bureaucracies that persist after the conditions that created them have ceased to exist. The Vogon poets who destroy Earth to make way for a hyperspace bypass, unmoved by any consideration of the people living on it, have spiritual descendants in every Vault-Tec administrator who filed paperwork for experiments that destroyed the communities they were meant to study. The cheerful indifference of large organizations to the human beings inside them is one of the great comic subjects of the 20th century, and both the Guide and Fallout have found ways to make that indifference funny and horrifying in the same breath. The Star Trek references in the franchise extend beyond the Guardian of Forever already discussed. Several specific episodes from the original series have inspired encounter designs and dialogue trees in both Fallout 1 and 2, drawing on the show's tradition of using science fiction premises to explore contemporary social questions. The franchise's general interest in philosophical dialogue, the tendency of its major characters to engage in extended ethical arguments rather than simply fighting, echoes the specific rhetorical style of Star Trek. Episodes in which characters work through moral problems in conversation rather than in action. The Master's philosophical coherence, already discussed, has a Star Trek quality to it. He is not simply a villain to be defeated, he is an argument to be answered. The Lord of the Rings has left traces in the franchise that are more structural than specific. The journey structure of the original Fallout, a single character emerging from a sheltered community and walking through a dangerous world in search of a specific object, echoes the Fellowship's journey with a fidelity that is probably too general to constitute a reference. But the specific quality of melancholy that attaches to the post-nuclear landscape, the sense of a world diminished from what it once was, of people living in the shadow of a greater age, is Tolkienian, in a way that feels deliberate. The Fallout franchise is, among other things, a story about people who can see the ruins of greatness all around them and cannot rebuild it, and that is one of the central emotional registers of Tolkien's legendarium. The Western film genre has been a consistent influence on the franchise that sometimes reaches the level of specific reference. The frontier aesthetic of the original games, the lawless towns, the traveling merchants, the bands of raiders who function like outlaw gangs, drew explicitly on the visual and narrative vocabulary of the spaghetti western, and specific film references appear throughout. The New California Republic's political structure borrows elements from John Ford's Cavalry Pictures. The whole town as character quality of many Fallout 2 settlements echoes the ensemble work of films like Tombstone and Unforgiven. The franchise's most heroic figures tend to be solitary wanderers who arrive from nowhere, solve a specific problem, and leave, which is the structural premise of almost every Western ever made. Section 10. Developer Signatures and Inside Jokes. The Fallout franchise has, from its earliest days, maintained a tradition of developers embedding themselves in the worlds they build not as heroic figures or narrative presences, but as signatures, as evidence of presence, as the game development equivalent of initials carved into a desk. These signatures take many forms, and tracing them is one of the more quietly rewarding activities available to the deeply attentive player. The Golgotha Graveyard in Fallout 2, already mentioned, is the most concentrated example of this tradition, a cemetery that functions as a memorial, not for fictional characters, but for the actual people who built the game. The developers who placed their own names on those tombstones were making a statement about mortality and legacy that was both self-deprecating and, in retrospect, moving. Many of those people have gone on to long careers in the industry. Some have not. The names on those graves are still there, in the game files, waiting to be discovered by players who will never know anything about the people attached to them. It is a form of persistence that is genuinely unusual. Most people leave no permanent trace of their work. These names will be there as long as anyone plays Fallout 2. Chris Avalone's self-insertion in Fallout 2 developed into a tradition that he maintained across his subsequent work. The Fallout New Vegas add-on Dead Money contains a character who is widely read as a metaphorical self-portrait, a man who has built an elaborate prison of his own design and cannot bring himself to leave it, who has accumulated enormous resources and has no clear purpose for them, who is intelligent enough to see his own situation clearly and not intelligent enough to change it. Whether this interpretation is correct is something Avalone has been characteristically oblique about in interviews, but the personal quality of the characterization is difficult to dismiss. The most interesting developer self-portraits are always the ones that show something unflattering, and Avalone's appears to be that kind. Josh Sawyer's presence in New Vegas extends beyond the Lonesome Drifter songs. Sawyer released a personal gameplay mod for New Vegas after the game's official lifecycle ended, a rebalancing mod that adjusted the game's economy, difficulty, and item values according to his own design preferences. The mod, called jsawyer.sp, was never officially supported and was released on his personal blog with no fanfare. It is, in essence, a director's cut the game as Sawyer would have made it if commercial pressures had not required compromises. The mod has become a canonical part of how serious New Vegas players experience the game, and it represents a form of developer signature that is genuinely unusual. Not embedded in the game itself, but appended to it after the fact. A second layer of authorial presence that sits transparently over the original. The Gary in Operation, Anchorage, already discussed, is named after a real member of Bethesda's development team. The choice to name the escaped clone, the Gary who made it out, who crossed the wasteland alone, who exists in a storage room in the Outcast base saying Gary at people who have no idea what to do with him after a real colleague, has a quality of affectionate teasing that is characteristic of game development culture. The joke is gentle. The Gary persists. Fallout 3's loading screen tips include a small number of entries that are not gameplay tips at all, but personal statements. One loading screen tells the player, without context, that Braun is a bad person. This is a reference to Dr. Stanislaus Braun, the villain of the Tranquility Lane sequence, a scientist who has trapped a community of people in a virtual reality simulation and has been tormenting them for 2 centuries. The loading screen tip, delivered in the register of a genuine gameplay hint, is the developers breaking frame to register a direct moral judgment on one of their own characters. It is funny, and it is also a signal. Even the people who created Braun think Braun is a bad person. The development of New Vegas took approximately 18 months, a production period that was, by any standard, extremely compressed for an open-world role-playing game of that ambition and scale. The time pressure is visible in certain areas of the game's polish, and the developers have acknowledged it in subsequent interviews. What is less acknowledged but equally visible is the way the pressure seems to have intensified the personal quality of the work. The Sawyer songs, the Avalone self-portraits, the density of private references, The sense throughout the game that the people making it were working at maximum capacity and putting everything they had into it, including the things that were most personally meaningful to them. A game made under pressure by people who care about it has a different texture from a game made under pressure by people who are just trying to finish it. New Vegas is, unmistakably, the former. The tradition of naming in-game locations after real places known to the development team runs through the franchise. The geography of the Capital Wasteland in Fallout 3 is, to a significant degree, the actual geography of the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, including suburbs and landmarks that Bethesda's Maryland-based team would have known personally. The distances between locations, the positioning of landmarks relative to each other, the choice of which neighborhoods to include and which to omit, all of these reflect a familiarity with the real terrain that goes beyond what a map study would produce. Bethesda built their home into the wasteland, which gives the Capital Wasteland a specificity that the Mojave and the Commonwealth, developed by teams with different geographic connections, do not quite replicate. The Brotherhood of Steel's Elder Maxon, who appears in Fallout 4 as a young and intense military leader, is named after a character who appeared in the first Fallout game, a descendant of the Brotherhood's founder, continuing a line of leadership that the franchise has tracked across centuries. The naming is a gesture of continuity, a way of saying that the institution persists and that its succession matters. It is also a developer signature of a different kind, a way of acknowledging that Fallout 4, whatever its departures from the original design, is connected to the first game by a thread that was placed deliberately and with attention to where it leads. Emile Pagliarulo, who served as lead writer on both Fallout 3 and Fallout 4, has a background in musical theater that occasionally surfaces in his writing. Certain characters in both games have a heightened rhetorical quality, a tendency toward performative self-expression that feels more theatrical than naturalistic, that reflects this background. It is not exactly a developer's signature in the conventional sense, but it is a way that a developer's biography has shaped the product, which is perhaps a more interesting form of personal presence. The game designers at Obsidian who worked on New Vegas have a tradition of embedding specific arguments they were having with each other in the game's faction politics. The ongoing debate within the development team about the relative merits of ordered civilization versus individual freedom, a debate that reflects real disagreements about political philosophy among real people, produced the NCR versus New California, Republic versus House versus Yes Man structure, in which each major faction represents a coherent political philosophy rather than simply a team to join. The factions are, among other things, the developers' political arguments made into non-player characters. Playing through all 4 endings is, in a certain sense, attending the meeting in which these arguments were originally made. Section 11. The rarest discoveries. Low-chance events and hidden triggers. Some Easter eggs are not simply hidden, they are probabilistic. They exist in the game files and can be triggered, but the conditions for triggering them are so specific, or the chance of them occurring in any given moment is so low, that most players will complete multiple full playthroughs without ever seeing them. These are the Wasteland's rarest phenomena, and the community documentation of them is some of the most detailed and dedicated archival work in gaming fandom. The mysterious stranger is the most famous probabilistic element in the franchise. He appears during VATS, Combat Fallout's targeting system, at a fixed percentage chance that varies between games. When he appears, he fires a single shot from a powerful revolver and then vanishes before the game returns to normal time. He has appeared in every mainline Fallout game, always with the same visual design, always with the same behavior. His probability of appearing in any given VATS sequence is low enough that players with the relevant perk might complete dozens of combat encounters without seeing him, then encounter him 3 times in an afternoon. What makes the mysterious stranger interesting beyond his probabilistic nature is the way the franchise has treated him as a persistent figure whose presence accumulates meaning across games. He is not explained. His origin is not given. His motivation is not stated. He simply appears, fires, and leaves. Over the course of the franchise's history, various pieces of additional context have been added without resolving the central mystery. The Lonesome Drifter's mysterious magnum suggests a lineage. Certain character perks in different games suggest different theories about what he is. And a specific encounter in New Vegas where a character remarks on having seen him before, decades earlier, implies that he has been present in the wasteland far longer than any individual playthrough encompasses. The mysterious stranger's appearance also changes slightly between games in ways that players have documented extensively. In some games, his hat is slightly different. His coat is a different shade, his revolver is a slightly different model. Whether these changes represent different people who occupy the same role or a single figure whose appearance has been inconsistently rendered is a question the games never answer. The ambiguity is productive. It gives the character a mythological quality, the sense of a figure who exists at the edge of vision and changes shape depending on who is looking. The Deathclaw Promontory in New Vegas is one of the most notorious hidden locations in the franchise, not because it contains an Easter egg in the conventional sense, but because its existence as a location is itself the secret. The promontory is a stretch of terrain on the east bank of the Colorado River that is densely populated with high-level Deathclaws creatures that, at the point in the game where most players would discover this area, are strong enough to kill the player character in a small number of hits. The promontory is not mentioned in any quest. It has no clear purpose. It simply exists as a piece of terrain that is significantly more dangerous than its neighbors, and players who stumble into it before they are adequately prepared learn this lesson in a memorable way. The reason the promontory is worth discussing in the context of Easter eggs is that it contains, if you survive the crossing, a unique weapon that is not available anywhere else in the game. The weapon is a Ranger Sequoia, a powerful revolver associated with the NCR Rangers, resting on the body of a dead ranger who clearly made it to the promontory and did not make it back. The Ranger's journal, found nearby, describes the trip in as much detail as could be written in the time available. He knew what was coming. He went anyway. The Ranger Sequoia is the best revolver in the game, and to get it you have to earn it in a way that the game never describes but that feels, in retrospect, exactly right. The Roach King is a Fallout 4 encounter that resists easy categorization. In a specific area of the Commonwealth, if the player explores long enough, they may discover a throne made of debris and detritus, surrounded by a remarkably large number of radroaches. The radroaches are not immediately hostile. They are gathered around the throne. On the throne itself is a larger radroach. This radroach is the Roach King, and it has a name tag. It is a named creature in a game where most creatures are nameless. It has been here long enough to accumulate a following. It has achieved, in the specific limited terms available to a radroach in a post-nuclear wasteland, some form of sovereignty. The encounter asks nothing of you and gives nothing back. It simply exists, which is the purest form that an Easter egg can take. The random encounter system in Fallout 2 contained a probability-gated encounter with a film crew that would only trigger at specific times of day, at specific locations, after specific conditions had been met. The film crew was producing a documentary about post-nuclear life and was willing, in exchange for an interview, to give the player character a small amount of caps. The crew's director was named after a real-world documentary filmmaker. Their equipment was anachronistic in ways that suggested they had survived the bombs along with their gear. The encounter was so specific in its conditions that many players who completed the game multiple times never triggered it, and its existence was discovered primarily through data mining rather than through play. It is a piece of content that exists for its own sake, a joke that most people will never hear, placed in the world anyway because the world felt incomplete without it. The Dunwich Borer's vision sequence in Fallout 4 contains a hidden Easter egg within a hidden Easter egg. The visions that appear as the player descends into the quarry are fragments of pre-war memory scenes from the life of the workers who excavated the site. These fragments are presented as hallucinations, environmental events that appear and then dissolve. But several of the fragments, if viewed in a specific order and with attention to their content, reveal a connected narrative about a specific worker who encountered something at the bottom of the quarry and was changed by the encounter in ways he could not articulate. This worker's story, assembled from fragmentary visions that are not labeled or explained, constitutes a complete arc with a beginning, a middle, and an ending that most players experience as scattered ambient content rather than as a structured narrative. The narrative is there, in sequence, waiting to be assembled by a player patient enough to stand still in the dark and look. The Captain's Footlocker in Far Harbor is one of Fallout 4's most probability-dependent hidden items. The Footlocker appears in a specific location in the expansion and contains a unique weapon, but the weapon's presence in the Footlocker is not guaranteed. It appears based on a random determination made when the Footlocker is first generated, meaning that some players who reach the location will find the weapon and some will find an empty Footlocker. The community documentation of this encounter spans considerable discussion about whether the probability is actually fixed or whether it varies based on player level, character build, or other factors. No consensus has been reached, which is appropriate. It is a Footlocker that may or may not contain what you came for, in a universe defined by exactly that kind of terrible uncertainty. The glowing sea in Fallout 4 is one of the most hazardous regions in the game, a stretch of southwestern terrain that received direct nuclear strikes and has never recovered, where radiation levels are lethal to unprotected players, and the landscape has a quality of eerie, luminescent devastation. Most players approach the glowing sea exactly once, for a specific main story quest, and leave quickly. Players who explore it more thoroughly, however, discover a small number of encounters and locations that exist purely as secrets, things placed in the most dangerous part of the map, because the developers knew that only a specific kind of player would ever find them. The encounters include a hidden cult settlement, a unique non-player character who has been living in the radiation and who has developed a relationship with it, and a specific terminal entry that raises questions about the nature of survival that the main story never asks. The glowing sea rewards the player who is willing to stay uncomfortable. Section 12. The deepest lore, unsolved mysteries, and fan theories. The Fallout franchise has, across more than 25 years of active community engagement, generated a body of fan theory and unsolved mystery that rivals that of any fictional universe. Some of these mysteries are unsolvable by design. They exist in the games as productive ambiguities, spaces where multiple interpretations are equally supported by the available evidence, and the game declines to arbitrate between them. Others are mysteries whose solutions may exist in game files or developer documents that have not been made public. And some are simply questions that arise naturally from a world detailed enough to have internal inconsistencies, questions the games did not intend to raise but cannot prevent being asked. The question of foreknowledge, whether the pre-war American government knew the nuclear exchange was coming and chose to proceed anyway, is one of the franchise's most carefully maintained ambiguities. The Vault-Tec experiments, which were clearly planned and implemented before the bombs fell, imply significant lead time. The construction of the vaults required years of work and enormous resources. The selection and notification of the vault residents required bureaucratic infrastructure. The engineering of the specific experimental parameters required advanced research. All of this was happening while, to the ordinary citizens of Fallout's America, daily life continued normally. People went to work, watched television, bought Nuka-Cola. The question of how much the government knew and when it knew it is never answered. But the evidence of the vaults implies that the answer is more than they said, and earlier than anyone would have wanted to believe. The Vault-Tec and Enclave connection is another of the franchise's great unresolved questions. The Enclave, the remnant of the pre-war federal government, which reappears in Fallout 2 and Fallout 3 as an antagonist faction, clearly had knowledge of the vaults and the experiments. Their goals, which involve genetic purity and the restoration of America under the government's control, are consistent with the kind of long-term population management thinking that the Vault experiments represent. But the precise nature of the institutional connection between Vault-Tec and the Enclave, whether they were separate organizations with a covert relationship or different public and private faces of the same entity, is something that the franchise gestures toward repeatedly without ever fully resolving. The 2024 Fallout television series suggested its own interpretation of this relationship, which the game community has received with the particular mixture of enthusiasm and skepticism that new canonical material always generates. The Courier, the player character in New Vegas, is one of the franchise's most philosophically interesting figures, precisely because of how little is known about them. Unlike the lone wanderer of Fallout 3, whose backstory is given in considerable detail through the opening sequence, or the sole survivor of Fallout 4, whose pre-war life is established before the bombs fall, the Courier is almost entirely a blank. They are defined by what they do rather than by what they were. Their history before the game's opening is mentioned only in the most elliptical terms, and the game's NPCs, when they try to describe the courier to each other, consistently fail to produce a coherent picture. A ghost, one character says. Someone nobody expected to survive, says another. The courier's blankness is not an oversight, it is a design choice that makes New Vegas's protagonist the most purely existentialist figure in the franchise, a person who exists only in their actions, who has no nature prior to the choices the player makes for them. The Dunwich entities, the nameless presences implied by the Dunwich Building in Fallout 3 and the Dunwich Borers in Fallout 4, suggest a mythology that spans both games and that the developers have deliberately kept incomplete. The two locations are separated by significant geographic and temporal distance within the fiction, but they share a vocabulary of wrongness, the same symbols, the same ritual arrangements, the same quality of ancient malevolence. The implication never stated is that whatever was contacted or worshipped at these sites was present in the world before the bombs fell, that the nuclear catastrophe did not create these entities but may have strengthened them or freed them in some way. The absence of explanation is the point. The most effective horror is the horror that cannot be named, and the Dunwich mythology in Fallout honors that insight by withholding the name. The mysterious stranger's identity remains the franchise's most discussed unsolved mystery. The leading theories among the fan community fall into several categories. The first, and most popular, is the dynasty theory. The mysterious stranger is a role passed down through generations, with different people filling the position over the centuries since the bombs fell, each wearing the same costume and carrying the same weapon because the role requires it. The Lonesome Drifter's mysterious magnum supports this reading. It is a weapon that has been passed on, evidence of a lineage. The second theory is the supernatural theory. The mysterious stranger is not a person at all, but a manifestation of something luck, justice, narrative gravity that the wasteland has generated in response to the player's presence. This reading is supported by the impossibility of his appearances and by the fact that he seems to operate specifically in contexts where the player is using VATS, a targeting system that appears to slow time. The third theory is the simplest. He is just a man, a very good shot with a very reliable horse who has been helping strangers for a very long time, and asking more of him than that is the kind of question that ruins perfectly good myths. The Institute's origins and its relationship to MIT, fictionalized in the game as CIT, the Commonwealth Institute of Technology, are addressed in some detail in Fallout 4's main story, but the question of what the original CIT researchers intended and what they actually created remains contested within the game's fiction. The Institute presents itself as the future of humanity, the rational continuation of the scientific project in a world that has otherwise abandoned rationality. Its critics, which includes most of the other factions in the game, see it as an organization that has lost touch with humanity in the process of trying to preserve it, that has made artificial humans and cannot decide whether to treat them as tools or as people, that has retreated so completely from the world above ground that it no longer understands what it is preserving humanity for. Both positions are given serious representation in the game's dialogue, and the player is never told which one is correct, because the game is genuinely uncertain and wants the player to be uncertain too. Pre-war morning in Fallout 4, the brief, playable sequence before the bombs fall, functions as the game's most effective horror device, and it does so by doing almost nothing. You are a person in a normal house, in a normal neighborhood on a normal morning. The television is on. Your spouse is making breakfast. Your infant is in the crib. The news is reporting something alarming, but news is always reporting something alarming. The sky is clear, then the sky is not clear, then the game's prologue ends. What makes this sequence so effective is its deliberateness. The developers have built an entire world to show you what you are about to lose, and they have populated it with just enough domestic detail that the loss is personal rather than abstract. The cups on the table, the toys on the floor, the television commercial for a product that will never be sold again. These details accumulate into something that, when the bombs fall, feels like a bereavement rather than a story beat. The children of the cathedral in the original Fallout carry a hidden layer of horror that most players who completed the game on its original release missed entirely. The cathedral is the headquarters of the Master's super mutant army, and the children who populate it are presented, initially, as a religious organization zealous, slightly unsettling, but not obviously threatening. Returning to the cathedral after completing certain story beats reveals that many of the children are themselves being processed for mutation, that the religious trappings are a recruitment mechanism, that the entire organization is both a cult and a pipeline. The reveal is more effective for having been prepared by the seemingly ordinary behavior of the children in earlier encounters. This is character design as Easter egg. The secret was visible all along in behaviors that only became legible retroactively. The backstory of Harold, a recurring character in multiple Fallout games, a human mutant with a tree growing from his head, cheerful in the face of impossible circumstances, has accumulated across games into one of the franchise's saddest and most quietly moving character arcs. Harold appears in Fallout 1 as an eccentric merchant with an unusual accessory. By Fallout 3, that accessory has grown over decades into a full-grown tree, and Harold is rooted to the earth in a forest in the capital wasteland, unable to move, tended by a small community of people who worship him as a god. He does not want to be worshipped. He wants to die, which he cannot do. The Fallout 3 quest associated with Harold asks the player to decide his fate, which is the kind of decision that the franchise makes meaningful by having prepared it across 3 games and many years. The tree's name is Bob. Harold has been keeping this man named Bob alive inside his own head for decades. He seems resigned to it. The fate of the pre-war world, the specific mechanism by which Fallout's nuclear exchange differs from our own Cold War near misses, is itself an unsolved mystery of sorts, because the franchise has been deliberately vague about which side fired first. The game's political geography implies that the war between America and China was long-running, that resources were the primary cause, and that both sides had been in a state of continuous, low-level conflict for years before the bombs fell. But the specific trigger event, the thing that turned a Cold War hot on the 23rd of October 2077, is never clearly identified. Multiple sources within the games offer different accounts, none definitively authoritative. This ambiguity is probably deliberate. A nuclear war without a clear first mover is a nuclear war in which everyone is guilty, which is a statement about the nature of nuclear deterrence that the franchise seems to want to make. Three Dog's role in the franchise's broader mythology is worth examining at length because he is, in a certain sense, the franchise's self-image. He is someone who has decided that the most important thing he can do in a ruined world is preserve the idea of a world worth living in, not by rebuilding infrastructure or solving political problems, but by talking, by curating, by maintaining the sense that there is still something worth listening to. His radio station is not powerful enough to change anything material about the capital wasteland. It cannot feed anyone or cure radiation sickness or rebuild a government. What it can do is be there, consistently, saying that things might get better. Three Dog is the franchise's argument that the act of narration is itself a form of survival, that telling stories about the world is part of what keeps the world worth surviving. What all of these Easter eggs ultimately point toward the developer signatures, the hidden lore, the cryptid mythology, the probabilistic encounters, the Lovecraftian presences, the musical selections, the pop culture references embedded in the architecture of the wasteland, is a specific and unusual quality of presence. The Fallout games are, in some fundamental sense, about absence. They are set in a world defined by what is gone: people, institutions, buildings, entire ways of life. The bomb craters and the empty vaults and the pre-war messages on terminals that were never read are all evidence of a void that cannot be filled. But the Easter eggs are evidence of the opposite. They are evidence of presence. Someone was here. Someone thought about this. Someone put their music in a stranger's campfire and did not sign it. Someone named a dog after a Futurama episode and placed it next to a grave. Someone sat in a recording studio and decided what kind of voice the wasteland needed. The games are full of absence, and they are also full of these small insistences that absence is not the whole story. The Fallout franchise has never been sentimental about the end of the world, but it has always been deeply sentimental about the people who survived it, and about the people who built the game, and about the connection between those two things, between the worlds we imagine and the lives we live inside them. Every Easter egg is a little piece of that sentiment, pressed into the dust of the wasteland for someone to find. The franchise, if you step back far enough, is itself a kind of Easter egg. It was built by a small group of people in the late 1990s who had no expectation that it would outlast them, who embedded their private jokes and their literary enthusiasms and their personal music and their own names in graves because they wanted to leave something behind. 25 years later, those things are still there. A generation of players grew up not knowing the names of the people who made these games and knowing, without being able to explain how, that something personal had gone into the making. The connection between maker and player that Easter eggs create is a form of intimacy that crosses time. The developer who placed Dogmeat in the Cafe of Broken Dreams in 1998 could not have known that someone in 2025 would find him there and feel something specific about the finding, but they put him there anyway. And someone did find him, and something was felt. The wasteland is a long walk. It is full of dark places and difficult choices and the remains of things that deserved better than what they got. But it is also full of campfires where strangers play music, and dogs who wait for people who are not coming back, and skeletons arranged in poses that tell jokes across decades. It is full of developers who signed their work with a precision that none of them were required to achieve. It is full of the kind of love that goes into making something for strangers and trusting that the right strangers will find it. That is what we have been walking through tonight. Not just a game. A record of people who cared. A desert full of evidence. And now the wasteland is quiet again. The fire at the Lonesome Drifters camp has burned down to embers. The radio is playing something slow and old and beautiful, and somewhere very far away, mister. New Vegas is telling an empty casino that the night is young and the music is just getting started. Sleep well. The wasteland will be here when you wake up. It always is. If this reached you tonight and gave you something to drift off to, a like goes a long way. It helps these find the people who need them. And subscribe if you want more. There are more wastelands to walk through, more worlds that were built by people who loved them and left traces of that love in every corner. We will find them together, slowly, in the quiet. Take care of yourself out there. War never changes, but you do. Expansion, the architecture of secrets, how Fallout hides its best things. There is a specific art to the way Fallout hides content, and it is worth spending some time with the craft itself before we go any further into the catalog of secrets. Most games that contain Easter eggs hide them in one of a small number of ways. A room that requires a specific key, a character that only appears at a certain time of day, a sequence of actions that unlocks a non-standard ending. Fallout uses all of these methods, but it also uses something rarer and harder to describe, a method that relies not on mechanical gatekeeping but on the player's willingness to read carefully, to look at things that do not announce themselves as interesting, and to resist the pull toward the next objective. The single most important design decision in the franchise's history, from the perspective of Easter egg culture, was the choice to fill the world with readable text. Every terminal, every holotape, every scrawled note on a kitchen counter, all of it is optional. None of it is required to complete any quest. All of it is there for players who want to know what happened in the places they are walking through. This design decision, which dates back to the original 1997 game and has been maintained across every entry in the franchise, created the conditions under which Easter eggs could exist not just as discrete hidden objects but as hidden narratives, complete stories told through the incidental documents of a world that has moved on without anyone to read them. The Corvega assembly plant in Fallout 4 is, on the surface, a dungeon, a large raider-occupied factory that the player fights through in order to complete a specific quest. The quest ends, the factory is cleared, and most players move on. But the factory's terminals and notes contain a complete story about a specific worker named Earl Sterling, who spent 30 years on the assembly line and wrote extensive personal reflections in his work terminal. Earl is not a quest giver or a companion or a character who does anything in the fiction. He is a voice preserved in the text of the place where he worked, and his reflections on work, on age, on the specific quality of a life spent doing the same thing every day in the same building, are among the most fully realized pieces of writing in the game. Most players never read a word of it. The story is there for the players who do. This approach to hidden storytelling creates a specific kind of relationship between the game and the player, one based on trust rather than direction. The game trusts you to read the things you find. It trusts you to be curious about the people who left messages in places where nobody was going to come looking for them. It trusts you to find a skeleton in a recliner watching television static and to sit with that image long enough to feel something about it. This trust is unusual. Most games guide their players aggressively, ensuring that important story beats are seen, marking the significant moments. Fallout marks almost nothing. It simply puts things in the world and waits. The waiting quality of Fallout's hidden content is something that longtime fans talk about in a specific way, as if the game knew you were coming and prepared for you. This is obviously not true in any literal sense. The developers did not know you specifically. But the care with which the content was placed, the precision of the references, the completeness of the hidden stories, the deliberateness of the developer signatures creates the subjective experience of a world that was made for you to find. This feeling is the real achievement of the franchise's Easter egg culture. It is not just about the secrets themselves. It is about what the secrets communicate about the people who made them. The storytelling inside the silence. Environmental narrative in Fallout. One of the franchise's great contributions to game design is its development of environmental narrative, the practice of telling stories not through dialogue or cutscene, but through the arrangement of objects in a space. This technique, which has become standard in the industry largely because of Fallout's influence, allows the game to communicate entire histories without ever explicitly stating them, trusting the player to read the physical evidence of events that occurred before the game began. The classic example is the two skeletons holding hands in a ruined house. You find them in Fallout 3, in a suburban home on the outskirts of the capital wasteland. They are lying side by side on a bed, their skeletal hands touching. There is no note, no holotape, no dialogue from an NPC telling you what this means. The meaning is constructed entirely by the arrangement of the skeletons and the fact that you are standing in a bedroom in a house that clearly housed a family. These two people were together when the bombs fell. They came here to wait for the end together. The scene communicates something complete and specific without saying a single word, and it does so in a way that is more affecting than a dialogue sequence precisely because it requires your imagination to complete it. The apartment building in Fallout 4 that contains a man who has been locked in by his neighbor's robot is a longer, more comedic example of the same technique. The man left notes on his door. The robot left notes in the hallway. The escalating, slightly surreal argument between them is preserved in physical documents that you read out of narrative sequence, assembling the story as you discover the notes. The story is complete. It has characters, conflict, escalation, and an implied conclusion, and none of it is told through any conventional narrative mechanism. It is archaeology. You are figuring out what happened here the way an investigator figures out what happened at a crime scene, and the satisfaction of assembling the story is inseparable from the physical experience of moving through the space where it occurred. These environmental narratives are Easter eggs in a broader sense than usual. They are not references to other cultural products or signatures of individual developers. They are complete fictional histories, hidden in the physical arrangement of a game world that most players experience primarily as an obstacle course. Finding them requires the same qualities that finding conventional Easter eggs requires: attention, patience, willingness to look at things that do not announce themselves as significant, but the reward is different. Instead of recognizing a reference or identifying a developer's name, you are discovering a person. You are learning who lived here, what mattered to them, and how it ended. The franchise has always been aware of this technique and has developed it with increasing sophistication across its entries. Fallout 3 introduced the template. New Vegas refined it, particularly in its dungeon design, where almost every significant location contains a complete story in its documents. Fallout 4 expanded the scale, creating environmental narratives of greater length and complexity than any previous entry. Fallout 76 applied it to the specifically interesting challenge of a world without NPCs, a game in which all human characters are already dead when the player arrives, and in which every story is told exclusively through the objects they left behind. The fan community as co-author, how players complete Fallout's secrets. The Easter egg tradition in Fallout cannot be understood in isolation from the community that has formed around discovering and documenting the franchise's hidden content. The fan community has, over more than 25 years, built an infrastructure for Easter egg hunting that includes wikis, forums, subreddits, video series, and data mining tools, an entire secondary intellectual project dedicated to the cataloging of hidden things. This infrastructure has changed the relationship between the game and its players in ways that the original developers could not have anticipated. The Fallout Wiki, known as the Vault, is one of the most comprehensive game documentation projects in existence. It contains detailed entries on every Easter egg in every game, with evidence citations, developer confirmation status, and ongoing debate about contested interpretations. The level of rigor applied to this documentation is unusual for fan projects. The wiki distinguishes between confirmed Easter eggs, likely Easter eggs, and speculative connections, and requires evidence for all classifications. This scholarly approach to hidden content has, over time, created a body of knowledge about the franchise's secrets that is more complete and more reliably sourced than anything the developers themselves have published. The data mining community, players who extract and examine the game files directly rather than discovering secrets through play, has been responsible for finding a significant percentage of the franchise's most obscure hidden content. The probability-gated random encounters in Fallout 2 that have never triggered in normal play are known to the community because someone went into the files and found them. The developer signatures and texture files, the hidden audio and ambient sounds, the unused content that was never fully implemented, all of this was discovered through a form of inquiry that bypasses play entirely and goes directly to the source material. This is not how the developers imagined their Easter eggs being found. The implicit assumption of the Easter egg tradition is that secrets exist to be discovered through play, through exploration, through attention, through the kind of patient wandering that characterizes a good Fallout playthrough. Data mining bypasses all of that and goes directly to the answer, which changes the relationship between the secret and the finder. The data miner knows about the fish crew encounter in Fallout 2 not because they stumbled upon it in an exhaustive exploration of the game's random encounter zones, but because they opened the relevant files and read the encounter parameters. The knowledge is the same. The experience of acquiring it is completely different. The community has developed its own norms around this distinction. Information discovered through data mining is acknowledged and discussed, but it occupies a different category in the community's imagination than information discovered through play. The person who finds the Dunwich Borers workers' hidden narrative by standing in the dark and watching the visions in sequence has had an experience that the data miner who read the vision trigger conditions in the game files has not had. Both know the same story. Only one has found it. The YouTube community dedicated to Fallout Easter egg documentation has produced a body of video content that functions, in aggregate, as the most accessible version of the franchise's hidden lore. Videos ranging from short clips showing specific encounters to multi-hour retrospectives on the franchise's hidden history have been viewed by audiences far larger than any single playthrough could produce. This means that millions of people know about Fallout's Easter eggs who have never found them personally, who know about Seymour and Novak and the Dunwich Borers' vision narrative and the Gary clone in operation. Anchorage because someone made a video about them, rather than because they found them in the world. This changes the nature of the Easter eggs themselves in an interesting way. A secret that has been fully documented and widely shared is no longer a secret in any meaningful sense. But it retains something of its original quality, the warmth of the original discovery, preserved in the documentation, communicated secondhand through the video or the wiki entry or the forum post. The Easter egg tradition, in this sense, has evolved from a hidden communication between developers and their most attentive players into a cultural inheritance, passed down through the community, available to anyone who wants it. The loneliness of the wasteland. Fallout as meditation on absence. The most consistent emotional quality of the Fallout franchise is loneliness, not the sharp, acute loneliness of recent loss, but the settled, ambient loneliness of a world that has been empty for a long time. The specific color of Fallout's loneliness is produced by the combination of physical space and human evidence. The world is vast and mostly empty, but everywhere you go, there are traces of people. Terminals still running, photographs on walls, holotapes left by people who were talking to no one in particular, recording their thoughts in the hope that someone might eventually listen. This combination, physical emptiness, human residue, is what makes the franchise's Easter eggs feel the way they do. In a less carefully constructed world, a hidden developer signature or a pop culture reference would simply be a fun discovery. In Fallout's world, it is something more. It is evidence that someone was here. It is one more trace of presence in a world defined by absence. The skeleton watching television is a joke. It is also a portrait of loneliness so complete and so specific that it transcends its own comedy. Here is a person who was, presumably, not watching television when the bombs fell, who had to have been watching television already for the skeleton to be positioned that way. Or perhaps they decided at the end that there was nothing to be done and they might as well be comfortable. The joke and the tragedy are identical. The comedy of the image and the sadness of the image are produced by the same arrangement of the same bones, and the franchise trusts the player to hold both simultaneously. This tonal complexity, the refusal to choose between funny and sad, between ironic and sincere, is what the Easter egg tradition in Fallout expresses at its best. The dogmeat encounter in the Cafe of Broken Dreams is both a charming nod to the franchise's history and a genuinely poignant image of waiting and loss. The Gary clones in Vault 108 are both one of the funniest things in the franchise, and, if you sit with them long enough, something much stranger, a meditation on identity, on what is left when everything that makes a person distinctive is stripped away and only the name remains. The loneliness of Vault 108 is the loneliness of a world in which the same thing keeps happening over and over, in which the name Gary echoes through identical corridors, from identical throats, until it loses all meaning and becomes pure, rhythmic sound. The Fallout TV series. Expanding the Easter egg universe. The 2024 Fallout television series, produced by Amazon Prime Video, introduced a new dimension to the franchise's Easter egg culture by translating the game's hidden content into a different medium. The series was written by people who clearly loved the source material deeply, and it is dense with references, callbacks, and hidden details that reward viewers who have played the games extensively. The most celebrated Easter egg in the series involves the pre-war Vault-Tec corporate meeting sequence, which expands on lore that the games had only hinted at. The revelation that Vault-Tec did not simply prepare for the nuclear war, but actively conspired to start it, is the kind of implication that the games had been building toward across multiple entries without ever stating directly. The show stating it explicitly and populating the room where the decision was made with recognizable corporate executives was a significant moment in the franchise's canon, the kind of event that sent the community back to the games to reread terminal entries and dialogue with fresh eyes. The series also introduced several small Easter eggs that referenced specific moments from the games. The specific way characters move through post-nuclear spaces echoes game mechanics in ways that feel like translation rather than adaptation. The humor is calibrated to the specific register of the game's ironic, gentle, finding the comedy in horror without minimizing the horror. The choice of pre-war music for certain sequences extended the franchise's long-standing curatorial relationship with that particular aesthetic. And buried throughout the production design are objects, logos, and brand names from the games that appear in the background of shots at a level of detail that rewards pause and scrutiny. The series also generated new fan theories and Easter egg hunts. The identity of certain characters, the implications of certain reveals, the connections between the show's timeline and the game's established history, all of these became subjects of community investigation that produced the same kind of careful, evidence-based analysis that the game community had been applying to in-game lore for decades. The franchise's Easter egg culture had expanded to encompass a new medium, and the community's tools and methods traveled with it. What endures? The legacy of the Easter egg tradition. The Fallout franchise's Easter egg tradition has, across its history, established a set of practices that have influenced the broader development of hidden content in games. The idea that a game's world should reward the player who reads everything, who talks to every character, who explores every corner, this is not a new idea, but Fallout executed it with a consistency and a richness of detail that set a standard that subsequent games have tried to reach. The tradition of developer self-insertion, of leaving personal traces in the worlds you build, has been taken up by numerous studios working in open-world RPGs. The environmental narrative technique, the story told through object arrangement rather than dialogue, has become a standard approach that games like Dark Souls, The Last of Us, and BioShock Infinite have built entire design philosophies around. The tone of Fallout's Easter eggs, the combination of sincere affection, dark comedy, and genuine pathos has influenced how games think about the relationship between hidden content and emotional register. But the franchise's most durable contribution may be simpler than any of these techniques. It is the idea that a game should be made by people who are putting themselves into it. Their reading, their music, their jokes, their private references, their names on graves in post-nuclear deserts, and that this personal investment is visible in the finished work and meaningful to the players who encounter it. This idea, executed with the specific richness that the Fallout series brought to it, produced a body of work that does not feel like a product. It feels like a world that someone loved into existence. The Easter eggs are evidence of that love. They are the visible residue of thousands of decisions made by hundreds of people who cared about what they were making. They are the marks left in passing. Kilroy was here by people who were moving through the creative process as quickly as they could, and who still found the time to place a dog named Seymour next to a grave, to scratch a Guardian of Forever into a desert encounter table, to leave their own names on tombstones in a location named after the place where Christ died. Every secret in the wasteland is a conversation. The developer is on one end of it. You are on the other. The bombs fell 200 years ago, and somehow the conversation is still happening. That is the real Easter egg. Everything else is just how you find it. And now the wasteland is fully quiet. The static on the radio sounds almost like breathing. Mr. New Vegas has signed off for the evening. Three Dog has pre-recorded something Wolsestain and hopeful for the morning. The skeleton in the recliner is still watching television. Dogmeat is still waiting. Somewhere out there, a man named Gary is making his way across the ruins of a civilization, saying the only word he has. And it sounds, in the dark, like a kind of music. Sleep well. The wasteland will be here when you wake up. It always is. If this reached you tonight and gave you something to rest to, a like means the world. It helps these videos find the people who need them most. Subscribe if you want to keep walking through quiet worlds together. There are more wastelands to explore, more secrets to find, more evidence of people who cared pressed into the walls of worlds that were made with love. Take care of yourself out there. War never changes, but you do. Good night. The deep geography of the Mojave. How New Vegas hides its heart. Fallout. New Vegas occupies a specific place in the franchise's emotional history that is difficult to reduce to a simple description. It is the most personal of the mainline games, the one that feels most like it was made by people who had a clear and specific vision of what they wanted to say and who said it as directly as the medium allowed. The Mojave Wasteland is, in many ways, the franchise's most complete expression of its own sensibility, the retro-futurist irony, the philosophical complexity, the hidden depth that rewards the player who looks carefully at everything. The geography of New Vegas's secrets is different from the geography of Fallout 3's or Fallout 4's. Fallout 3 distributes its hidden content across a wide map in pockets of density, the Dunwich Building, the Number Station, the specific Easter egg-laden floors of certain dungeons. Fallout 4 layers its hidden content vertically, often hiding the most significant material in the basements of locations whose surface-level encounters suggest nothing unusual. New Vegas hides things horizontally, in the margins and peripheries of a map that is designed to push the player toward the center. The most significant secrets are at the edges in the inaccessible east, in the northern desert, in the territories that the game's factions define as dangerous or irrelevant. To find New Vegas's hidden content is to resist the gravitational pull of the game's narrative center and walk away from it into territory that the game's own structure treats as unimportant. The Divide, the ruined landscape featured in the Lonesome Road expansion, is the furthest of these peripheral spaces, and it functions as New Vegas's most complete hidden world. The Divide is a place where the history of the franchise's setting becomes legible in new ways, where the Courier's personal history intersects with the franchise's broader lore, and where the environmental narrative technique is pushed further than in any other part of the game. Every building in the Divide is telling a story about a specific moment in the conflict between the NCR and Caesar's Legion. Every road sign, every piece of military equipment, every shattered civilian vehicle is evidence of a specific history. Walking through the Divide without reading any of this evidence produces the experience of a linear shooter. Walking through it while reading everything produces a complete historical record of a catastrophe that happened before the game began. The Dead Money expansion takes this tendency to its logical extreme. Dead Money is set entirely in a location that has been isolated from the rest of the game world, the Villa, a pre-war luxury resort built by a jet-set billionaire named Frederick Sinclair. surrounded by a cloud of toxic gas that kills anyone who enters. The expansion's central mystery concerns Sinclair himself, his love affair with a woman who was working against him, his decision to build the villa as a monument to that love, and the specific ways in which his creation became his prison. The story of Sinclair and Christine is told entirely through the villa's architecture and documents through the specific choices made in the building's design, through the terminal entries and holotapes scattered across the property, through the physical space that Sinclair built to house something that never existed. Dead Money functions as a hidden story about grief and obsession that most players miss because they are focused on the expansion's notoriously difficult gameplay. The villa is punishing in ways that make the player want to leave as quickly as possible, which means that the story of Frederick Sinclair, preserved in documents scattered across spaces where it is difficult to stand still, and read goes undiscovered by many players who complete the expansion's main quest. This is either a design flaw or a deliberate choice to hide the expansion's heart from anyone not willing to suffer for it. The community has, over time, decided that it is the latter. The moral weight of hidden content. What Fallout asks of its players. There is a form of hidden content in Fallout that is not an Easter egg in the conventional sense, not a reference to another cultural product, not a developer signature, not a probabilistic encounter, but that functions as a kind of test. These are the moral experiments embedded in the game's optional content, the choices and discoveries that are never required and that most players will never encounter, that reveal something specific about the kind of person doing the playing. Vault 11's sacrifice system, already discussed, is the most extreme example. The Vault's experiment is designed to create a specific moral situation, and the player's discovery of what happened there and the specific tragedy of the 5 survivors who chose to die rather than continue is a form of hidden content that works on a different register than jokes about Monty Python or signatures in graveyards. It is hidden content that asks you to feel something complicated, to sit with a moral problem that cannot be cleanly resolved, to hold the humanity of both the people who participated in the lottery and the people who refused it. The Lonesome Road's choice at the end, whether to launch nuclear missiles at NCR territory, or Legion territory, or both, or neither, is another form of this. The choice is available only to players who have completed the entire expansion, and it has permanent consequences for the game world. It is the most significant choice in the franchise, and it is hidden at the end of a piece of content that many players skip entirely. The game does not draw attention to this choice. It does not tell you that something important is available if you choose to pursue it. It simply places the choice in the world and waits for the player who will reach it. This practice of hiding moral weight behind optional content is characteristic of the franchise at its best. It reflects a specific belief about players that they are capable of handling complexity, that they will not be overwhelmed by difficult choices if those choices are presented clearly and given adequate context, that the most meaningful interactions in a game are the ones the player chooses to seek out rather than the ones the game forces them through. This belief is both optimistic and demanding. It asks a lot of the player's curiosity. It is, in a sense, the ultimate Easter egg, a moral challenge placed in the world for the player willing to find it. The texture of Fallout's humor. Why the jokes feel right. The humor in the Fallout franchise is a subject that deserves more analytical attention than it usually receives, because the franchise's comedy is doing something specific and technically difficult. The games are about the end of the world. They are about radiation, sickness, and genocide, and the collapse of civilization. They are about human experimentation and slavery and the systematic destruction of communities. They are also consistently funny, and the humor does not undermine the seriousness, because the humor is made of the same material as the seriousness. They come from the same place. The skeleton in the recliner watching static television is funny. It is also desolate. The humor and the desolation are produced by identical elements. The positioning of the bones, the presence of the beer can, the television static. The joke and the tragedy share a source. This is characteristic of the franchise's best humor, which is not satirical in the sense of attacking something external, but ironic in the sense of finding the world's own contradictions funny. The Vault Boy's cheerful thumbs up has the same quality. It is funny because he is performing optimism in a context where optimism is demonstrably absurd, and it is moving for exactly the same reason. The Easter eggs participate in this tonal complexity. The Monty Python references in Fallout 2 are funny, but they are also embedded in a world that is genuinely post-apocalyptic, a world of starvation and violence and the slow reconstruction of civilization from rubble. The Knights Who Say Ni exist in the same world as the Cafe of Broken Dreams and the Golgotha Graveyard. The comedy does not diminish the tragedy. The tragedy does not diminish the comedy. They coexist in the same space because that is how they coexist in life, where the funniest moments often occur in proximity to the worst ones, and where the human capacity for humor is most visible precisely when circumstances are most dire. The Gary clones embody this quality perfectly. 54 identical people saying the same word in the same corridors is objectively funny. But the specific way it is funny, the horror of homogenized identity, the violence of a society that has lost the capacity for differentiation, the way the word Gary becomes meaningless through repetition until it is only sound, is connected to something genuinely dark. The comedy is produced by the darkness. The joke cannot be separated from its content. This is why the Fallout franchise's Easter eggs feel different from the Easter eggs in many other games. They are not simply hidden fun. They are hidden fun that participates in the world's emotional logic, that draws from the same sources of feeling that the serious content draws from. That would not be possible in a world with a different emotional temperature. You could not transplant the Cafe of Broken Dreams into a game with a different tonal register and have it mean the same thing. You could not place the Guardian of Forever in a world that was not already saturated with the specific kind of longing that Fallout generates. The Easter eggs work because the world works. And the world works because the people who built it understood that humor and tragedy are not opposites. They are two modes of the same attention. Small things. The details that make a world feel real. Beyond the confirmed Easter eggs and the documented hidden stories, the Fallout franchise is built from an enormous accumulation of small details that are neither Easter eggs nor mandatory content, but that together create the texture of a world that feels inhabited rather than constructed. These details are not quite secrets. They are not hidden in the way that a locked room or a probability-gated encounter is hidden, but they require the same quality of attention that Easter egg hunting requires. And they reward that attention with a specific kind of pleasure. The cereal boxes in pre-war kitchens have names and mascots that are specific to Fallout's version of 1950s America. The cigarette brands are slightly wrong. The fashion magazines feature articles about pre-war styles that feel authentic to the period in ways that suggest the writers did research beyond what was strictly necessary. The names of pre-war corporations, Poseidon Energy, Hubris Comics, Mass Fusion are names that carry connotations and histories and a slightly wrong quality that places them in an alternative America rather than the actual one. The food canisters and the product labels and the advertising posters in pre-war interiors are all consistent with a specific vision of a specific moment in American cultural history that never quite happened. All of this is production design rather than Easter eggs, strictly speaking. But it is production design done with the same meticulous attention to detail and the same willingness to reward the careful observer that characterizes the franchise's Easter egg culture. The person who reads the cereal boxes and the cigarette brands and the advertising copy is engaging in the same activity as the person who finds the Guardian of Forever. They are looking for the hidden specificity of a world that was built by people who wanted every detail to be right. The holotape recordings scattered across the Fallout world are perhaps the clearest example of this principle applied to character. The holotapes are audio recordings left by pre-war and post-war characters, and they range from official communications to deeply personal confessions. The best of them are complete short stories, a man describing, in real time, his attempt to navigate a bureaucratic system that refuses to acknowledge his situation, a scientist recording her final observations as her experiment approaches a catastrophic conclusion, a child leaving a message for parents who have not returned from an errand. Each of these is a contained narrative that asks nothing of the player except attention, that offers no reward except the story itself, that exists because the world felt incomplete without the kind of people who would leave messages like this. The world of Fallout is, in this sense, a world made of messages. Pre-war people left messages for each other that nobody ever came to read. Post-war people left messages for anyone who might pass through. The developers left messages for their players embedded in the world's details and its hidden spaces. And the players, by finding these messages and documenting them and talking about them and passing them on, have become part of the same chain, adding their own messages, their own interpretations, their own responses to a conversation that started in 1,997 inches, a small office in California, and has not stopped since. That is what the wasteland is, at its deepest level. It is a message. It is full of evidence that someone was here, that someone thought this mattered, that someone cared enough to put their name on a grave and their music in a stranger's campfire and their jokes in the margins of an apocalypse. The bombs fell and the world ended, and somehow, in the rubble, there are still people talking to each other across impossible distances. That is the thing about Fallout that keeps people coming back. Not the combat or the crafting or the character builds or the political factions. The messages, the evidence of presence, the small, stubborn insistence, repeated thousands of times in thousands of hidden corners, that someone was here and it mattered. It is late now, wherever you are. The wasteland is dark and the radio has gone quiet, and the static sounds like breathing. Somewhere in the capital wasteland, Three Dog is broadcasting to nobody in particular, fighting the good fight, because he decided a long time ago that fighting the good fight was what the world needed even when nobody was listening. Somewhere in the Mojave, a man named Gary is still walking. Somewhere at the bottom of a very dark quarry, something old and patient is waiting for a visitor who understands what they are looking at. And somewhere, in a diner at the edge of time, Dogmeat is still waiting. Sleep well. The wasteland will be here in the morning. It always is. And there will always be more secrets in it, placed there by people who loved the world they were building and wanted you to find what they left behind. If this helped you find some quiet tonight, a like is the best way to say, so it helps these reach the people still looking for them. Subscribe if you want more worlds to walk through together, slowly in the dark. There are more out there. We will find them. Good night. The hidden music, ambient sound as Easter egg. Before leaving the subject of audio in the franchise, there is one area that deserves dedicated attention: the use of ambient sound as a vehicle for hidden meaning. The Fallout games have, since the earliest entries, used ambient sound not just as atmosphere but as a form of communication, a layer of the world that rewards players who listen as attentively as they look. The cave sounds in Fallout New Vegas are the most famous example of hidden audio content in the franchise. These ambient sounds, the creaking, rustling, distant water drip quality of underground spaces, were crafted with a specific hidden dimension. When certain of these tracks are visualized in a spectrogram, a tool that translates sound into a visual representation of its frequency content, they reveal images embedded in the audio. This technique, borrowed from experimental music and avant-garde sound art, allows information to be hidden in a medium that appears to contain only atmosphere. The creeper face visible in the spectrogram of Cave Sound 14 is one of these images. The Morse code spelling behind in Ambient Sound 21 is another. These are not accidental. They are deliberate acts of communication using the full dimensional space of the audio medium. The music disc 11 in the original game is a related piece of hidden audio content, but it operates through narrative rather than visualization. The disc's audio, a degraded, crackling recording that sounds like damaged tape, contains in its spectrogram a recognizable image of Steve's face and a sequence of numbers that decode to C418's name. The disc was, by itself, already among the most unsettling ambient audio in the game. The discovery of the hidden image transformed it into something more. A message embedded in a message. A signature hidden in static, a developer leaving his name in the place where only the most attentive would look for it. These hidden audio secrets require a different kind of attention than hidden visual content. You cannot stumble across them the way you can stumble across a skeleton in a recliner. You have to actively take the audio out of its natural context, apply an analytical tool to it, and interpret what the tool reveals. This is a more demanding form of discovery, and the community members who first found these images were not casual players but dedicated audio enthusiasts who were applying professional-grade analysis tools to game sound files in their spare time. The discovery that the game rewarded this kind of attention, that there was something to find if you looked hard enough in the right way, was experienced by the community as a specific kind of validation. The silence in Fallout is also doing work. The moments between ambient sounds, the gaps in the cave noise, the pauses in the wasteland wind are not simply empty space. They are the specific quality of silence that the developers chose to put there, calibrated against the surrounding content to produce a particular emotional effect. The silence of the Mojave at night, interrupted by wind and the occasional distant animal, communicates something different from the silence of a vault corridor, interrupted only by the hum of failing fluorescent lights. These silences are as carefully constructed as the sounds themselves, and they reward the same quality of attention. The franchise as time capsule, what Fallout preserves. The Fallout franchise is, among other things, a time capsule, a record of what a specific group of people cared about in a specific cultural moment, made durable by the medium of games. The references embedded in the early games are references to cultural products that were themselves recent or contemporary in 1997 and 1998. Star Wars, Monty Python, Planet of the Apes, the original Star Trek, the specific flavor of American popular culture that characterized the late 20th century. These references were placed in the games because they were familiar to the developers and presumably familiar to many players. 30 years later, they have acquired a different quality. They are historical evidence of what people who made games in the 1990s had grown up watching and reading. The later games' references, the Indiana Jones refrigerator, the Saw-influenced Death Maze, the Blade Runner questions in Nick Valentine's characterization document a different generational aesthetic, that of developers who were children in the 1980s and young adults in the 1990s, who grew up with a different set of touchstones. Tracking the franchise's Easter eggs chronologically is a way of tracking cultural generations, of seeing how the things that shaped different cohorts of developers left marks in the things they made. This time capsule quality gives the franchise's Easter eggs a resonance that transcends their specific content. Even a player who has never seen Monty Python and the Holy Grail can appreciate the Bridgekeeper encounter as evidence of something, as proof that certain cultural objects mattered to the people who made these games, that the games were made by people who had lives and enthusiasms and loyalties outside the project. The Easter egg does not require the reference to be recognized in order to communicate something about the people who placed it. It communicates something simply by existing. The franchise is now old enough that its earliest references are themselves historical. The players who encountered the TARDIS in Fallout 1 as a contemporary reference to a beloved television show are, many of them, now in their 40s or 50s. Their children play the franchise without knowing that the TARDIS was once a living cultural reference rather than a piece of gaming history. The franchise is preserving these references across generations, maintaining them in a state that is simultaneously alive and historical, present in a world that people are still actively playing, while also being evidence of a specific moment in the past. This is an unusual quality for a cultural artifact to have, and it is one of the things that makes the Fallout franchise worth caring about as something more than entertainment. It is a record, it is evidence, it is full of people who put themselves into the work they were doing and who left, as a result, something that will outlast them. Not the grand statements or the philosophical arguments or the moral complexity, those things matter too, but they were deliberate, planned, intended as the game's primary offering. What will outlast everything else is the specific private things, the names on graves at Golgotha, the music in a campfire, the dog who is still waiting. The fire has almost gone out now. The wasteland is as dark as it gets, which in Fallout is quite dark indeed. The sky never fully clears. The stars are always partially obscured by dust. The light has a quality of muted persistence rather than the full dark of a clear night. Somewhere in the capital wasteland, Three Dog has queued up something from before the war, something with a smooth harmony and a gentle piano, something that sounds like it was recorded in a room where people were comfortable and nobody was afraid. He has been playing it on rotation for decades. Nobody asked him to. He decided, a long time ago, that the wasteland needed it, and so he kept playing it. That is the kind of decision that the franchise asks us to understand as heroic. Not the combat skills or the survival instincts, but the decision to keep doing the thing that feels important even when nothing in the world is confirming that importance. The Easter eggs are that decision. They are the developers saying, "This matters, even if nobody finds it. We are putting it here anyway." We are putting our names on graves and our music in campfires and our private jokes in the margins of an apocalypse because we believe that someone will come looking, and when they do, we want them to find something that was made with love. You came looking, you found it. Now you know who was here. Sleep well. If this found you in the dark tonight and gave you somewhere comfortable to be for a while, a like goes further than you might think. It helps these videos reach other people who need quiet spaces too. And subscribe if you want more walks through these kinds of worlds. There are more secrets out there, in more wastelands, waiting for someone patient enough to find them. We will go together. Take care of yourself. Good night. A final note on playing in the dark. There is a specific quality to playing Fallout alone, late at night, with headphones on. The ambient music does something different to you in that context, the minimalist piano of the early games, or the ink spots playing from a Pip-Boy, or the distant GNR signal cutting through interference. The game was designed for this. It was designed to be experienced in a quiet space, with the world at a slight remove, which is why its hidden content is so well suited to the conditions under which this video was made and the conditions under which you are likely encountering it. The best Easter eggs are the ones that feel like they were left for you specifically. Not for everyone, not for the whole community, not for the average player, not for the person who finishes the main story and moves on, but for you, the person who stayed, who read the terminal entries, who walked north past the edge of the map, who stood at a campfire and listened to a stranger's music. The franchise's hidden content is calibrated to feel personal because it was personal. The people who made it were not thinking about the whole audience when they placed Seymour next to the gravestone or left their own names on the Golgotha markers. They were thinking about the player who would look long enough and carefully enough to find those things, and they were making something for that specific person. You are that person. This is for you. Rest well now. The wasteland keeps its secrets as long as you need it to. And when you come back, there will be more to find. The franchise has been running for nearly 30 years now. In that time, it has moved between studios, changed engines, shifted genres, expanded into television, and generated a community of millions of players who care about it with an intensity that is unusual even by the standards of devoted fandoms. Through all of that change, the Easter egg tradition has persisted. The private jokes, the developer signatures, the pop culture references, the hidden stories told through objects in empty rooms. New teams have inherited the tradition and maintained it. New games have found new ways to hide things for new players to find. This continuity is not accidental. It reflects something about what the franchise is at its deepest level, a kind of world building that is also a form of relationship, a communication between makers and players that has been ongoing since 1997. The things hidden in the games are evidence of that relationship. They are proof that the people making these worlds cared about the people who would inhabit them, and that caring was specific enough to produce individual acts of attention. A name placed on a grave, a melody placed in a campfire, a joke placed in the margin of an apocalypse, for the player who would one day come looking. You came looking. You found it. The conversation continues. Good night. The bombs fell 251 years ago, in the fiction. The game was released 28 years ago, in reality. Both of those timelines are now long enough that the things preserved in them have acquired the quality of history, things that happened in a world that still exists, but that is no longer quite the same world. The developers who placed the TARDIS in the first game are now in their 50s. The players who found it in 1997 are grandparents. The TARDIS is still there, in the files, waiting in the desert for someone to approach it and hear the whooshing sound. None of this has changed. The world moved. The wasteland stayed. And somewhere in the desert of Fallout 1, a small blue box sits in the sun and waits for a visitor who will understand what they are looking at. That is what the franchise does best. It waits. It trusts. It leaves things in places where someone with the right kind of attention will find them, and then it waits for that person to arrive. Here you are. The wasteland waited. Rest now. The Pip-Boy on your wrist keeps ticking. The radio keeps playing. And somewhere in the dark between the notes, someone left something here for you to find. That is what we have been walking through tonight. Not just secrets evidence. Evidence that someone was here, that it mattered, that the world was made with care by people who hoped you would notice. You noticed. That is enough. Sleep well.